Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Luffy and Nami spend time together and had relationship? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content, and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the ViceroyIcarus for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story. Link in the description. The first night on the Going Merry was peaceful. The sea was calm and the sky clear of clouds as far as the eye could see. Nami loved nights like these. She could navigate her way around the world and as far away from her problems as the red line would allow. It was a welcome reprieve from the hectic week that Nami had suffered. From her mission to rob Buggy blind, subsequently meeting Luffy, making a deal with said pirate, and then the whole ordeal with Captain Kuro and his 3-year plan. It was a lot to work through, but nothing Nami couldn't handle. Not that she had the choice anyway. Luffy was a strange one. For a pirate, at least. He had fought against every preconceived notion Nami had held against pirates many times over. That despite his selfish nature, he cared for those around him and would risk his life for both his dream and comrades. Slowly, but surely, sowing a seed of doubt in her mind about pirates. She had met and conned countless pirates these last 8 years, some multiple times, without a second thought to them or what they thought of her. Yet, with Luffy and his crew, Nami found herself getting attached. She was beginning to care. Nami leaned on to the railing of the Going Merry's bow. The reflection of the waxing moon shone brightly on the water's surface, leaving trails of silver all the way out to the horizon. Despite the peaceful beauty laid out before her, Nami couldn't shake the growing anxiety nesting in the pit of her stomach. She'd have to betray them soon. Every instinct Nami had cultivated since she was 10 screamed at her to do so. To cut the limb before it grew nerves. Lest she begin to lose sight of her goal. That was something that Nami could never allow. Luffy, for all his charisma and strength, would either die to the hands of the true monsters of the oceans, Shahahaha, or his naivety would break and he'd become the very thing he claimed to hate. Nami flinched at the thought and grabbed her shoulder tightly. For some reason, the thought of Luffy becoming like him horrified Nami to no end. Hearing the rubber man's kind and hearty laughter twisted by malice and hate. No, Nami shook her head. It wasn't worth thinking about. Besides, it was irrelevant. So what if Luffy was a good pirate? So what if Zoro wasn't the vicious monster he was made out to be? So what if Usopp had a genuinely noble goal? One exceptional crew does not disprove the rule. All pirates are vicious, murderous bastards. It was the rule Nami swore by. The one thing keeping her detached and safe from a fate worse than death. In her mind it was the symbol of her resolve that she'd never fall prey to pirates like Arlong ever again. So for her to even consider any pirate as anything less than an enemy was unacceptable. After all, how strong could her conviction be if it crumbled to a single dumbass pirate and his equally dumbass crew? Nami needed to crush that seed of doubt before it took root and sprouted. Nami heaved a deep sigh. It really did upset her at the thought of betraying them. At the anger and hurt that they'd look at her with. That Luffy would look at her with. But it needed to be done. It was a shame though. Luffy seems like such a decent guy. Resigning herself to her plight once more, Nami looked down to the ocean waves gently lapping against the Going Merry's bow. Silence reigned for what seemed like hours when the door, not so subtly, clicked open, making Nami leap out of her skin. It was Luffy. He stood in the doorway, eyes half-lidded, like he was about to fall asleep, and a half-eaten apple in his hand. He glanced up to the end of the deck, only just noticing Nami. "Oh, you're awake too." He took a large bite of the apple. "I thought you went to bed ages ago." After taking a breath to slow her racing pulse, Nami shot the captain a glare. "What of it?" She shot with no small amount of venom. Luffy shrugged and began approaching her. "Dunno." He took another bite. "You're not really the type to stay up late." Nami fought to keep her glare going as he stepped up to the bow's railing. The Going Merry's figure had the only thing between them. "Well, I could hardly sleep with you lot snoring so loudly." A blatant lie. It was that damned anxiety. Luffy blinked, now looking fully alert. "Oh really? Sorry about that then." He scratched the back of his head, looking genuinely apologetic. "What are you doing up? Now that we have a proper ship you won't be able to lay about till noon because you were up late." Nami leaned forward, hands on hips. She ignored her use of the collective we. Luffy chuckled merrily. "Don't worry about it. I'll get plenty of sleep." He finished the rest of the apple, chucking the core into the ocean with a plop. "I just got hungry is all, and we don't have much food left." The glare deepened. That's because someone has a stupidly big appetite and is constantly looking for midnight snacks. Nami's accusing tone went over Luffy's head with an audible whistle. Shishishishi. It'll be fine, we're going to go find a cook next, right? The confidence and trust in Luffy's tone was astounding. Confidence that they would in fact be alright, and trust that Nami would lead them straight to Bartai. It was disarming. Nami huffed an exasperated sigh, but it kind of sent her reeling mentally. Luffy knew Nami was a thief. That she betrayed people. Hell, she'd even betrayed him just minutes after they had met when she sold him to Buggy for a place on the clown's crew. Even Luffy wouldn't be stupid enough to think that her betraying him again wasn't an option. No one had ever put that kind of trust in her before. Unnerving would be a good way to put it. Yes, we are. Luffy grinned. Expectation met. He was just too easy to please, but simply getting a cook won't be enough if we straight up run out of food. Bartai is still 2 days away. She expected some kind of reaction from Luffy, like realization of the fact, or denial that it would happen, but he didn't even flinch. Then we'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen. He really was a simple man. A simple man of simple solutions. There was no two ways about it. Nami signed, shoulders relaxing and hands dropping from her hips. She couldn't stay upset at him for long. She looked over at her temporary captain. Luffy stood with a laid-back posture with an almost serene smile on his face. His usual red vest was unbuttoned. He probably couldn't be bothered to button it in the midst of wanting food and the ever-present straw hat on his head. That brought up a curiosity about Luffy. Why did he want to become king of the pirates? It was the grandest of titles out there, so Nami could see the appeal, but as for actually trying to go through with it, not a chance. Countless men and women, both stronger and with endless resources, have tried to claim the title only to fail miserably. What chance did a scrawny boy from the East Blue stand? Devil fruit or no? It had been 20 years since Roger passed. At this point, who even knew if the One Piece was real? Hey, you alright? Luffy's voice jerked Nami out of her reverie. He was looking at her with concern. Huh? Was the best she could manage. What do you mean? The captain tilted his head and folded his arms across his chest. Well, you were looking at me for a while without saying anything. I thought you had a stroke or something. Nami's jaw dropped at his assumption. No. What on earth would make you say that? Well, Gramps always said dealing with me would give someone a stroke someday. Luffy chuckled. I think he was talking about himself though. That left Nami a little speechless. Who would even say that to a family member? Even as a joke. Sure, Luffy was hard to deal with at times, but that seemed to be a bit excessive. So what's up? Luffy asked casually, like he hadn't said anything major. Nothing, I was just thinking. Nami said, trying to brush it off. That's dangerous. For you maybe. Luffy laughed at her effortless retort. Nami couldn't help but smile as well. Getting one up on Luffy wasn't hard, but it was satisfying. Once the laughter died down, they were met with a comfortable silence where they both turned to look out to the ocean ahead. For the first time all night, the anxiety that had taken hold of Nami unwound, leaving her feeling at peace for the longest time. Her every instinct was begging her to run before she got too deep, that she needed to throw the idiot captain overboard right away, hijack the ship and leave with all the money she'd gathered on this venture. But for the first time in forever, Nami couldn't bring herself to even entertain those thoughts. Even if it was just for tonight, she was able to just enjoy the peace and quiet, and for once, it was with someone who, no matter how reluctant she was, no matter how tentative it was, nor how painful it was, Nami could call a friend. What a difference a week can make. Sometimes weeks roll by like sand on a beach, and before you know it, years have passed, and nothing changes. You get into a rut of living out the same pattern over and over again. All in the name of a goal that never seems to get any closer. Then it all changes. One week and your world can be turned upside down. Everything you knew, everything you thought you knew, now lay in pieces at your feet. For Nami, she could not imagine a better feeling. A week ago she stood in this very spot on Mary's bow, leaning against the railing, contemplating her inevitable betrayal of the people who would soon become her closest friends. She spoke with the man who would save her life. They stood and laughed together as friends, even if just for a moment. Then Nami betrayed him. She led Luffy and his crew to Bartai to find a cook so they could continue his adventure. Having been reminded once more of the sword hanging over her, and her island's heads when she saw Arlong's bounty poster among Johnny and Yasaku's wanted poster collection, she steeled her resolve. As soon as everyone became distracted with Krieg, Nami made her move. She hijacked the Mary and set sail for Kokoyashi. Really, Nami had full faith that Luffy could beat Krieg. That was a given. She also knew he would come after her, at least to retrieve Mary and be on his way, or at most, to try and seek revenge on her for betraying him. That was also a given. After all, going by his reaction to Captain Kuro attacking his own men, betrayal was not something Luffy took kindly to. What Nami did not expect, however, was Luffy showing up, new cook in tow, and refusing to leave until Arlong's empire lay in rubble, and Nami fought him every step of the way, doing everything short of outright attacking the rubber man. She had put on her best cold bitch persona to try and push him away, but Luffy didn't fall for it for even a second. Hell, from what the others on the crew said, Luffy got pissed off at anyone who even suggested that she really was the person she tried to make herself out to be. Nujiko even tried to get them to go away. That maybe if they learned her story that they'd be satisfied and leave. But once again, Luffy showed no interest in any of it, and just walked off. With a fond sigh, Nami leaned onto the railing, like she had a week ago. The full moon shone even brighter than it had before. The ocean, splayed out before her, positively sparkled under its silvery rays as if filled with a renewed vigor. She couldn't help but smile at it. Everything seemed brighter to her now. Now that she was free, not only free, but with the genuine opportunity to fulfill her dream of mapping the world. All thanks to that rubbery dumbass she now called Captain. Looking back on the events of the last week really put Luffy into a new light in Nami's eyes. He was more than he led on to be. Or maybe people read him wrong. Who knows? But either way, he was an amazing man. In just the scant few days in which Luffy had known her, from meeting in Orange Town to her betrayal at Baratai, he judged her character well enough to know something was wrong, and cared enough to do something about it. Then when he arrived at Kokoyashi, he showed no interest in anything other than getting her back. He didn't even want to know why Nami was doing any of it. Oh, you're awake too. Nami turned to her captain. He stood at the far end of the deck, apparently having snuck out of the men's bedroom without so much as a peep. His straw hat planted firmly on his head, and a dopey expression painted across his face. I am. So are you. Again. Nami smiled at Luffy as he approached. It felt great to be able to smile so freely. Luffy stood beside her, Mary's head once again the only thing between them. What you thinking about this time? He asked. Nami blinked. What do you mean this time? Well, last week you said you were up thinking about stuff. So, maybe you're up thinking about stuff this time. Luffy said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. No, I said I was up because of your horrid snoring. It was a blink and you miss it moment, but Nami swore. Luffy looked at her, completely disbelieving a word she said. Then it was gone. He grinned. That's so? My bad. Moments like that made Nami doubt Luffy's intelligence. At least to a degree. The man has clearly never had a day of formal education in his life. To be honest, he'd struggled to pour water out of a boot if the instructions were on the heel. Hell, Nami would be surprised if Luffy could even read the instruction. Actually, now that she thought about it. Hey Luffy, can you read? That seemed to catch him off guard. Wait, what? Can you read? Nami fought to keep the smirk off her face. The man who not 2 days ago fought a literal monster, dropped a building on both himself and said monster, and lived to tell the tale, was gawping at her like a slapped fish. Priceless. Why do you want to know? Luffy stammered, clearly trying to avoid the question. A moment of weakness. You can't, can you? Nami's lip twitched upward. No, I can. He claimed, waving his hands desperately. Then why are so defensive, huh? Nami's eyes narrowed in mock suspicion. Luffy struggled to find an answer that clearly wasn't there. You know it is very important for the captain of a crew be able to read, you know? She pressed on, smiling like the cat that caught the canary. But her captain began sweating. His eyes darting left and right looking for any kind of writing to prove his literacy, but to no avail. Ha 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 ha. Nami couldn't hold it in any longer. It was just too funny. Luffy blinked, now completely lost as to what was happening. 1 minute he was being grilled about being able to read by his navigator, the next, said navigator is holding her stomach laughing like she'd just been told the funniest joke. It took a minute for Nami to curb her laughing fit. But finally she stood up straight and wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes. It had been so long since she'd laughed like that. It was like a breath of fresh air. Luffy was not nearly as amused as she was. He stood, arms folded, pouting with his cheeks puffed. It was kind of adorable. It wasn't that funny, he muttered. Nami took a deep, cleansing breath to steady herself, still grinning. I know. I just couldn't help myself, she said. You're just too easy to tease. Luffy turned his head away, pouting even harder. I am not, you're just being mean. The sheer childishness of his statement almost sent Nami back into another fit of giggles. How this man was a pirate captain worth 30 million, she'd never know. Just so you know, I can, in fact, read, Luffy said, still not looking at her. Nami sat back on the railing. Oh, I believed you. Luffy's pout dropped immediately as his head snapped back to look at her with an almost audible boing. Wait. You did? Not immediately. Almost as fast as the pout dropped was it back again. The speed at which Luffy could change his expression was straight up comical. Truly fitting for a man with a rubber face. After a few moments they both relaxed and fell into a companionable silence. What a difference indeed. A week ago Nami was contemplating her betrayal of the man beside her. Now she'd happily risk her life for him. Before, when they talked, she was anxious for the future, the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Now she was riding high on life. She couldn't help but think back to her question from before as well. Hey Luffy, why do you want to be king of the pirates? Luffy looked at her, eyebrow raised. To be free. Nami cocked her head to the side. A reasonable, if predictable answer. But not the one she was looking for. I guess that. But what made you want to go for it? There are plenty of other ways to go about being free, she said. Most would say simply being a pirate is enough. Luffy seemed to mull it over in his head for a second. That's just it. I don't want enough. I want all of it. I want to laugh the loudest, eat the most, fight the hardest. And for no reason, because I can. That's how free I want to be. He spoke softly, almost reverential at the idea of his dream laid out before him, but the underlying steel in his tones spoke to how determined he was to make it happen. It left Nami almost speechless. She was absolutely convinced he could do it. And she'd be the one to guide him to it. Luffy took off his straw hat and smiled at it. He held it like it was made of spun glass. In the moonlight Nami could see where she stitched up the damage dealt to it at the hands of Buggy. Also, Luffy said, I made a promise that I would become a great pirate and return this hat to Shanks. He'd mentioned Shanks before. Nami just assumed he was some kind of father figure to Luffy, like how Belmere was to her. Clearly, it wasn't so straightforward. Do you know where he is? Nope. Not a clue. All of a sudden the somber atmosphere that had settled around them dissipated. But that's part of the fun, right? The adventure. Luffy seemed reinvigorated, his sense of adventure sparking up out of nowhere. Now he looked ready to row the Mary himself to the nearest island just to try and satiate it. It nearly gave Nami whiplash. The rubber captain now relocated himself to his favorite seat atop Mary's head, swaying eagerly side to side, willing an island to appear over the horizon. The thing Luffy probably didn't take into account, Nami realized, was that the ship was anchored so everyone could sleep. A point made slightly frustrating considering the fact Luffy was the one who dropped the damned thing. On her orders, no less. His vigor was both contagious and exhausting. This conversation, Nami felt, gave her a better understanding of how Luffy ticked. Sure, on the surface, he was a reckless moron, with no sense of self-preservation. And he was. No doubt about that. But there was a lot more going on under the surface than most believed. Zoro must have known, being both first mate and the longest serving on the crew. Sanji must have caught a glimpse of it, given that last she saw of him at Bar Tai he was dead set on not becoming a shitty pirate. And if Usopp hadn't seen it, he would soon enough, of that much Nami was sure. And now she had seen it for herself. She didn't know what possessed her to do it. To have the sheer balls to even attempt it. Maybe it was the new lease of life that had been gifted to her with Arlong's defeat. Maybe it was the relaxed atmosphere that now pervaded the air around them. Or maybe it was that Luffy had given it to her before. Who knows? Nami reached up to Luffy's head and plucked the straw hat off of it, placing it on her own. The man himself spun around looking ready to swing a punch. He stopped when Nami smiled up at him, her hand holding the precious hat firmly in place. She winked. Then we're just gonna have to make sure it's the best damn adventure ever, huh? Luffy was no stranger to late nights. He never was one to sleep a lot anyway. Maybe when he was a kid, but it was quickly stamped out of him when he moved to go live with Dayton and the others. Either from staying up late with the bandits, or from getting up early to go get food. There never was much time for sleep. Now it was just a habit he couldn't shake. Not that he wanted to, so here he stood on Mary's deck in the dead of night. Everyone had gone to sleep a couple hours ago, leaving him in on the deck in silence. Silence was boring. Usually. Luffy never liked it. The loneliest parts of his life were in silence. Memories of an empty house flashed through his mind's eye. Dust drifted through the air like flies. Grandpa wasn't around again. The party bar was closed on Sundays, so no playing with Makino. The kids of the town wanted nothing to do with him, calling him weird and a monster. Luffy didn't like them anyways. All he could do was sit on his bed and stew on his lonesome. Toys lay strewn about the floor of his bedroom. Marine white and blue were colored gray in the faint light that shone through the curtains. It was oppressing. He couldn't take it. So lonely. Luffy shook his head, desperately chasing away the images that clouded his mind. He wasn't alone anymore. Not for a long time. Since he met Shanks, Ace, Sabo, and everyone else. Even now, out here on Mary's empty deck, in complete silence. He wasn't alone. His crew, his amazing crew, were laying in bed, sleeping not far away. Nights like these weren't too bad anymore. Nami even gave him company a couple times. It was really nice. They'd talk about stuff and she'd ask loads of questions. Questions she should have known the answer to. Nami was an idiot sometimes. Not that he minded. She also made fun of him both times they were out here. Nami was also really mean too, still though. It was nice of her to keep him company on nights like these. Even if she was only out because she couldn't sleep, or was thinking about stuff. Thinking about his crew as a whole, Luffy still had to pinch himself sometimes. He had his very own crew. He was now living his childhood dream. Going on not just a grand adventure, but the grand adventure. The mere thought of it was enough to rile him up. And all in all, Luffy was pretty proud of his picks for his crew. All of them were ambitious, an absolute must, capable, another must, and most of all, they believed in him as much as he did them. They were his friends. Luffy couldn't help but grin as he imagined them all standing beside him. Zoro, his first mate and swordsman. His dream was to be the greatest swordsman in the world. Neither he nor Luffy would accept anything less. Nami, his navigator and acting second mate. Though with the way she barked orders, you'd think she was captain. She wanted to draw a map of the world. An idea Luffy was totally behind as it was more adventures for him. Usopp was a sniper and acting shipwright. His goal was less humble than the others, but it was noble and honest, and having met his father, Usopp would achieve it without a doubt. And finally was Sanji, the cook and martial artist. He wanted to find All Blue, the greatest sea in the world, where all others met. The thought of it was a wonder to Luffy, and the adventure to go find it would be to die for. The sound of soft footsteps altered Luffy to someone approaching him from behind. He looked over his shoulder. It was Nami. She looked fresh out of bed. Her hair, usually so neat and looked after, was ruffled and she was rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. It was kind of cute. "Oh, you're up too." It was becoming his normal greeting for her now. Nami responded with a wide yawn. "You don't look so good." That earned him a solid glare. Luffy just laughed. It was hard to be intimidated by her when she looked like she literally dropped out of the wrong side of the bed. The current rumpled state of her light blue pajamas certainly sold it. "Shut up," she mumbled. Nami pulled up beside him and plopped ungracefully onto the deck. She wrapped her arms around her legs and rested her chin on her knees. Honestly, she looked like she was about to fall back asleep at any second. Luffy sat down cross-legged beside her. "I got up to get some water when I saw you out here." She mumbled, "You looked lonely." "Really?" His navigator hummed. "Yup, you were just standing here, staring off in the distance." "It's not like you." "I guess so." Luffy agreed, "But I wasn't lonely, I have you guys." "Ah, so I shouldn't have bothered then?" Nami didn't sound particularly put out. She might have been teasing him. "No, but I'm glad you did." Luffy chuckled. He really was. "I like talking to you like this." Nami looked at him surprised. "So?" Luffy nodded merrily. "It's nice. I normally just walk round the ship till I get tired. Sometimes Usopp and Zoro keep me company before they need to go to bed." He explained. "So, having you to talk to really great." Again Nami hummed, her voice tranquil like the night sky. Though that may have just been her being tired. Either or was fine. This was the third night they'd talked like this. Luffy kind of hoped it would continue. While he was never lonely anymore, having someone with him so late at night was something he'd never say no to. It was selfish, but that had never stopped him before. They sat in silence for a few minutes. The gentle rocking of the ship was peaceful and the soft blow of the sea breeze was pleasant, if a bit on the cold side. The sky was overcast tonight, blocking out the majority of the moon's light. In fact, Luffy could only just make out where the moon was through the cloud. A strange thing happened. It wasn't massive, like an epiphany or something, but it was a rare thing nonetheless. The wires Luffy's brain sparked to life for a mere second, and thought occurred. He looked across the deck, back towards where Nami had come from. He could barely see the main cabin of Mary. Its silhouette was faint and there were no lights on inside. So, applying the usually useless skill of thinking, Luffy was able to reason out something. Hey Nami, why did you come out here? I told you. I went to get some water, saw your sorry ass and thought I'd join you for a bit. Her voice was muffled slightly by her knees. I get that. But how do you know I was out here? What do you mean? You were standing in the middle of the deck. Kinda hard to miss, but I can barely see the cabin from here. Shouldn't it have been hard for you to see me? That brought a small, tinkling laugh from Nami. Look at you, using your head for once. She teased, not gonna get all intelligent on me now, are you? Luffy stuck his lower lip out in a pout. This is why he never did any thinking. He wasn't any good at it, and he always got shit for it when he did it. No, I was just wondering, is all. Do you want me to admit that I was looking for you or? She trailed off. Nami had shifted her head so that her cheek rested on her knees. She looked at him with half-lidded eyes and a slight smile. It made something in the pit of Luffy's stomach twist. He looked away, pouting even harder. Are you gonna tell me or not? Another soft laugh. I was actually looking for water. If that's what you mean. Luffy couldn't help but deflate a little, but I did look out the window to see if I could spot you. 'Cause you always seem to be up. Luffy nodded. That was fair, but how did you see me? It's so dark. Nami sighed with a fond shake of the head. I had the light on, you dolt. You were so into your own world you didn't notice. It went out like 5 minutes ago. Oh. That made more sense. So, what you're saying is, you can't see in the dark? There was a pause. They looked at each other, Luffy looking completely earnest in his question, and Nami looking back at him in complete disbelief. It carried on for a few more moments. And couple more moments. Was she having a stroke? Luffy mentally added doctor to his list of future crewmates. Really? That's what you were thinking about? Nami whisper yelled. She smacked him over the back of the head, the mark instantly swelling to comical proportions. Luffy grasping at it, hissing in pain. How was it that she could hurt him? He was made of rubber. Oh. I'm sorry, I couldn't figure it out. This is why Luffy never did any thinking. Nami put her chin back on her knees. It was her turn to pout now, it seemed. What did she expect him to say? He was just curious is all. She was like that for a few minutes. So long it was kind of worrying Luffy. Are you upset? Not the best start, going by the few times he had to ask Makino and Aiden that question, but it was all he could come up with. No. You're just an idiot. Oh. Well, that went better than expect. That was good. They lulled back into silence after that. Luffy didn't mind it. Sure, silence was no longer something he equated to loneliness anymore, but that didn't mean he enjoyed it. Luffy was a creature of pleasure. If it wasn't fun, why bother? So silence was never something he indulged in. Yet, these last few nights, he was okay with it. It was strange. Luffy was pretty sure it was all to do with Nami. It wasn't that he enjoyed her company any more than the other members of the crew. Definitely not. But he couldn't help but think he wouldn't be able to sit so peacefully were it with Zoro or Usopp. It was just different. Well, now that he thought about it, thinking it seemed, to a certain extent it seemed, was unavoidable. A lot of things to do with Nami was different. She was a girl. She tried to leave the crew. Hopefully she was the only one stupid enough to try that. And she was the only one Luffy trusted with his hat. Probably because he knew that if something happened to it, Nami would be able to fix it. That seemed reasonable. Luffy felt something shiver on his shoulder. It was Nami. She had fallen asleep at some point, and had leaned up against him for support. Her arms were still around her legs, but grip was loosening by the second. It wasn't helped by her shivering. It was kind of cold out. Luffy couldn't feel it as much due to having a rubber body. Something to do with insulin or whatever it was called. Carefully, Luffy picked her up. One arm under her knees and the other across her back. Ever so slowly Luffy worked his way back inside. He tried turning the lights on with his cheek, but the power was gone. That would make things really tricky. With tentative steps and muscle memory, Luffy worked his way through the kitchen, into storage, then finally down the steps into Nami's bedroom. Thankfully her hammock was near the steps, so he found it quickly. Luffy put Nami onto the hammock as gently as he could, and pulled as much of the blanket out from underneath her as he dared and threw it over her. It was probably time for bed for him as well. As Luffy made his way back to the men's room, he couldn't help but think, maybe silence wasn't so bad after all. Ha! Luffy, you're so bad at this. Shut it, Usopp. It's really complicated. Luffy, we're playing gin rummy. I literally cannot think of an easier game that isn't for kids. Well, if you're so smart, you explain it. I have. 3 times. Leave it, Mosshead. This is clearly over his head. As much as it physically pains me to admit, you might be right. Hey, you guys are being mean. We'll stop making fun of you when you stop being such a shitty dumbass. Not gonna happen. Nami stood in the doorway between storage and the meeting room, watching the rest of the crew mock their captain for his sheer ineptitude with card games. Zoro and Sanji sat with arms folded and all cards on the table. Usopp had just placed his last set down. Luffy, on the other hand, it wouldn't be incorrect to say he was holding half of the deck of cards. It was mind-boggling how much Luffy struggled with card games of all things. Still, it was nice to see them all relaxed and happy together. Nami only wished she could be like that. The day they had all been through was immense, to say the least. Meeting a marine with a devil fruit that rendered invulnerable to all forms of harm on its own was almost too much for them. Add on the reemergence of Buggy. It was almost too much in general. Almost. Though, at the end of the day, they had made it out with their lives, even though it seemed to take a moment of divine providence. Lucky was a better word for it, Nami thought. In the month and a bit that she had known her captain, he'd never been defeated. Arlong had been Luffy's biggest threat by half, and even then, given the former's inherent advantage in both size and strength, the fact Luffy could even match him was a testament to the rubber man's strength. Yet, in Logtown, he'd been beaten. Twice, in quick succession. So casually by Smoker, and so significantly by Buggy. He had nearly died. If Luffy's luck wasn't so godly, their adventure would have died in the cradle. Oh, you're up too. The familiar greeting pulled Nami from her thoughts. Apparently she'd been standing around long enough for the others to take notice of her. I am, she replied. So are you. Luffy just grinned. Honestly, not even a near-death experience could shake this man. Not that I'm not ecstatic to see you, Nami dearest, but why are you up? Sanji asked. His crush for her was as strong as ever. Honestly? It was kind of sweet. Though, it would mean more if he didn't act like that around every girl he met. Either way, Nami would milk it for all it was worth. Yeah, didn't you hit the hay like 2 hours ago? Usopp asked as he was packing away the deck of cards. She did, but she couldn't sleep and was hoping to talk to Luffy some. Not that she'd tell them that. I did. And while I'm all for teaching Luffy new games then mocking him for being bad at them, Luffy huffed, put out, does it really have to be so loud? Zoro tooted audibly, I didn't think a witch like you needed sleep. Nami's brow twitched. Hey! Don't you dare call Nami dearest a witch, shithead! A fire had lit itself in Sanji's eyes. He had shot from his seat, sending his chair crashing into the opposite wall. They were really going to doing this. Yeah? Got a problem with that crap cook? Zoro stood to face him, Yubashiri half-drawn. Again, their foreheads pressed together, either budging an inch. Sparks flew between them. Usopp was laughing nervously and not so subtly backing off. Luffy seemed to find it all funny. Knock it off! A pair of fists crashed into the 2 idiots' skulls, knocking clean through the air, cracking the far wall of the room. Nami stood, fists smoking. I'm not in the mood for your shit right now, she yelled, so can you knuckleheads cool it for one night? Whoa, Nami. Usopp breathed. You okay? Of course not, she snapped. Usopp flinched, looking genuinely scared. Nami caught herself on. She hadn't realized it, but her heart was racing a mile a minute, and she was panting as if she'd run a lap of the red line. She knew she was stressed, but this was far more than she thought. The day gone by combined with the day they would have tomorrow was getting to her. Zoro and Sanji fighting just seemed to push her over the edge. Pausing for a moment, Nami took a deep breath. Counted to 5. Then breathed out. Counted to 5 again. Feeling slightly better, she looked at Usopp. I'm sorry, Usopp, you didn't deserve that, she said, bowing her head to the sniper. I'm just feeling a little wound up. Hey, it's fine. Usopp placated. I'd be wound up too if I had to deal with them too. If that's what he thought, Nami wasn't going to correct him. He wasn't completely wrong, to be fair. Zoro picked himself off the ground with a grunt. He gathered up his sword that had been thrown about when Nami hit him. Well, I think that might be the signal for us to go to bed, he said, cracking his neck with an audible pop. Yeah, we got a big day tomorrow. Usopp agreed. We're finally hitting the Grand Line. He was probably the most enthusiastic one in the room. Zoro and Sanji just nodded with confident smirks. Nami clutched her forehead. Luffy, who had been watching the whole ordeal unfold with a mixture of amusement and concern, just grinned that dopey grin of his but also said nothing. One by one, Usopp, Sanji and Zoro bid Nami goodnight, though not before Sanji apologized so profusely he looked about ready to get on his knees to beg forgiveness. Nami ushered him away with a smile and waved it off. Soon, Luffy and Nami were the only ones left in the lounge. Nami all but collapsed into a seat at the head of the table. She rested her head on her folded arms with a weary sigh. Luffy just watched her with a curiously neutral expression. You're stressed. It wasn't a question. What gave it away? Nami bit out. My charming interaction with our beloved crewmates? It's not cause of Sanji and Zoro, is it? Always to the point with Luffy. There was a pause. No. Not entirely. Nami sat up and looked her captain. He was staring back at her. His expression could be mistaken as blank or even aloof, but the slight crease in his brow and downturn of his mouth betrayed his concern. Without looking, Luffy leaned back in his chair and grabbed a bottle of alcohol from the drinks rack behind him. Rum, most likely. Will this help? He set the bottle on the table, offering it to her. Nami couldn't help but smile. Luffy was earnest in his desire to help, if nothing else. You trying to liquor me up, Captain? She teased. Luffy shook his head. Nope. Just this stuff normally helps people relax. Either the implication went completely over his head, or he understood it entirely. Nami couldn't tell which. Thanks, but I'll pass, she said, waving it away. I don't want to be hungover tomorrow. That's fair enough, I guess. Luffy shrugged, putting the bottle back on the rack. So, what's on your mind? Nami averted her gaze and looked at her hands. She'd steepled her fingers together in an effort to avoid fidgeting. It's just like Usopp said. It's a big day tomorrow, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We're going to the Grand Line. It's going to be great. Luffy enthusiasm began seeping through. It's the first step for all our dreams. It really is. Nami sighed, not sounding nearly as eager. But in order to get there we need to cross Reverse Mountain. Her captain cocked his head to the side. What's that? Nami's stress spiked. You don't even know how to get into the Grand Line, do you? Shishishi, nope. Luffy laughed casually. But that's why I have you, isn't it? A vein pulsed in Nami's brow. He wasn't wrong, but would it kill him to have some kind of foreknowledge or planning? That's not the point, she whisper-yelled, being wary of the others, having just gone to bed. Stuff like this is important. You should, at least, know of this. All right then. Luffy looked her dead in the eyes. His previous merriment subsided. Tell me about it. The sudden change in her captain's demeanor threw Nami for a loop. She never could predict when he would take things seriously. Well, anything that wasn't a fight, that is. Maybe he recognized that this was, in fact, a pretty big deal? Then again, it was Luffy. So maybe not. It's not simple. Try me. Maybe he was taking this seriously? Nami pinched her the bridge of her nose. It was too late in the day for this shit. Reverse Mountain is one of the 2 no entrances to the Grand Line, the other being the Calm Belt. Luffy looked focused, so Nami pressed on. It's a completely unique phenomena in that it has 4 rivers that flow up its side, meet at the top, and then flow back down into the Grand Line. It's the only known place in the world that this occurs. Though calling them rivers is a bit of a misnomer. See, they are more like immensely strong ocean currents that have forced their way up the mountain due to the sheer difference in climate temperature between it and the 4 blues. So in order to access the Grand Line we need to go up the East Blue Current. So, not only will we have to thread the need to the incredibly narrow entrance, but turn the ship mid-air, then land it in the only marginally wider Grand Line current. all while making sure the Mary doesn't crash in the walls of the Red Line, killing us all. Nami stopped for breath, having gone through everything she thought relevant to the mountain. Luffy, to his credit, was still focused, but the strain it was putting on him to remain so was clearly evident. His face was flushed pink, blood clearly being redirected to his brain to help with processing the information dumped on him. Maybe she went a little overboard, Nami thought as she watched a vein pulse in Luffy's temple. It took a couple minutes, but the regular color returned to Luffy's face. He nodded confidently and smacked his fist into his palm. So it's a mystery mountain, he stated. No, you idiot, Nami hissed, smacking him around the back of the head. Luffy just laughed casually, shrugging the blow off. I don't see what the big deal is, he said. We'll make it through just fine. You're a brilliant navigator. Once more, his sheer unwavering confidence in her and her abilities was something that caught Nami unawares. A smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Thank you, Luffy, that means a lot. It really did. She had more than enough confidence in her own abilities, but to hear it come from someone like Luffy really helped. And I know I'm a great navigator, but Nami hesitated for a moment, considering her words. This is something beyond anything I've done before. The slightest miscalculation or poor call could be the end of us. Luffy's smile softened. You shouldn't worry too much, just focus on getting the job done. We're all with you, every step of the way. He laughed merrily. Beside, I'm pretty tough. I'd make a decent bump for Mary. No small amount of relief flushed through Nami. He was right. Maybe if she just let go of what happened today, forget it ever happened, like he seemed to have, and focus on getting up the mountain, she might just do it. Nami grinned back at him. Thank you, Luffy. That's helped a lot. Shishishi, no problem. With a firm pat to her cheeks, Nami stood up, ready to get herself back off to bed, and then prepare for what was to come. Her hand grasped the door knob to the storage room when Luffy spoke again. That wasn't the only thing, was it? Nami froze in place. What do you mean? She couldn't make herself look at him. I didn't choose you to join my crew if something like a little self-doubt could get to you like it did. You're better than that, he said, his tone plain and to the point. What was really keeping you up, Nami? It's nothing, Luffy, I promise, she whispered, staring straight at the door ahead. Her knuckles were white against the doorknob. I'll see you in the morning. She just needed to get to bed and forget it. Nami, please. The amount of concern in his voice made Nami's heart skip a beat. Slowly she turned to look at him. Luffy had stood up and now stood behind her, just a few feet back. His shoulder back straight, fists clenched by his side and his brow creased. His entire frame was racked with worry. Nami let go and turned to face him. You almost died today. Twice. Luffy nodded. And yet here you are acting like nothing happened. Luffy nodded again. Frustration built up at the base of Nami's throat. It burned like fire. She wanted nothing more than to yell at her captain, but restrained herself as best she could. How? She choked out. Luffy shrugged. 'Cause I didn't. He didn't get it. He didn't realize what his death would mean. You bastard. What? You bastard. Her captain stumbled back several steps, shocked over her sudden outburst. Honestly, she was too, a little. But then again, she'd been holding this all day, with no intent of ever letting it out. So, she didn't really care. You don't even realize what would have happened if you had died. Tears were welling up in her eyes. Nami wiped them away as quickly as they formed. She would not cry over this. If you died, what would have happened to us? To Usopp, to Zoro, to Sanji. To me. She was approaching full volume without a care. The others had probably been woken by now. Luffy looked completely dumbstruck. He swallowed. You'd have worked something out. Nami bit out a sarcastic laugh. Yeah, we would. We'd have all gone home. She marched a couple steps to him. If you died, our dreams would be in tatters. At this, Luffy's legs seemed to give out, and he collapsed on his ass. Nami continued unabated. Even if we'd found it within ourselves to carry on to the Grand Line, without our strongest fighter and most driven member, we'd be killed almost immediately. By some honeypot trap or a bigger fish. Nami loomed over her captain, a dark cloud swirling around her. You got reckless, Luffy. Arrogant even. Buggy bested you. He had you in shackles. Buggy did that. If that storm hadn't hit, you'd have lost your head. And with Smoker. You spent so long going round feeling invincible that, hey! I didn't. Luffy tried to butt in. When you finally met someone who was, you got caught. Nami rolled on. You need to be more aware. In the Grand Line, people like Smoker will be a dime a dozen. We won't survive a week. Luffy stared up at her, biting his lip trying to look defiant. His effort was weak at best. The sight of her captain below her was so endearing to her. Nami forced back a smile, but as quickly as her anger came it dissipated. The realization struck her square in the head. She'd almost lost her captain today. She's almost lost her friend. When she swore she'd never lose another person again. This wasn't like with Arlong. Luffy fought hard, and came out victorious. Today, he'd been defeated utterly. Nami's knees gave out, and she dropped to the ground in front of Luffy. He looked back at her, looking lost for words. Tears were welling up in her eyes again. Luffy, you almost died today. We almost lost you. She held back the sob that threatened to wreck through her. As much as you depend on us, we depend on you, Luffy. You're the reason we're all here. Why, you're right. Luffy said, his voice quiet. I'm sorry. They looked up at the same time, and their gazes met. Luffy offered a gentle smile. I'll do better, I promise. He said, forgive me? Nami half-heartedly slugged his shoulder. Idiot, of course I do. With that, Luffy offered out his arms and pulled Nami into a hug. Quietly, she let the tears fall. They both pretended not to hear the door to the deck click gently shut. They stayed like that for a while before pulling back. Nami dried her eyes on a nearby tea towel. Sorry, I got your vest wet. Honestly, she felt kind of embarrassed for having unloading onto him like that. Luffy looked at the 2 large wet marks on his shoulder and chuckled. It's no problem. I got a few of these and it's not like I'm anywhere for people to see. Nami laughed with him. If you're sure. She said though, I think we best get some sleep now. Yeah, probably should. Luffy grinned brightly at her. We got a big day tomorrow. Haha, yeah, we do. Luffy dropped his smile for a second. Thanks for that, Nami. I think I needed to hear that. Nami blinked in surprise, not so much at the admission but the fact he thanked her for it. Anytime, Captain. She replied jovially. They went to the door at opposite ends of the lounge, intent on their respective bedrooms. Nami just cracked the door open when a thought struck her. Hey, Luffy? HM? They looked back at each other, the distance seeming like nothing at all. Promise me something, yeah? Sure, what is it? Don't die. The request hung in the air for a few moments. Nami waited with bated breath. Luffy just grinned. I promise. Thank you. Storms, Luffy decided, were super cool. Though, that was under the condition that you weren't in the middle of the thing. He sat on Mary's newly repaired head watching the dark clouds swirl over the horizon. Lightning flashed, bright and powerful, followed closely by the deep rumble of thunder. Luffy had made a game of counting the seconds between the two. Something about the gap between thunder and lightning having to do with how far away it was, or at least that's what Ace told him. He might have been joking. Lightning flashed. A pause. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. RUMBLE. Luffy whistled. Wow. New record. It helped that it was at night too. It made the storm easier to hear and see, what with it being so dark and quiet. The Grand Line had already been everything Luffy hoped it would be. The storms, the icebergs, and especially the giant whale. He even got to pick a fight with it. Everything had been so much fun. The trip up Reverse Mountain had been difficult like Nami predicted, but not impossible. His navigator had expertly guided the Mary up the side of the mountain, then back down again. Though, she wasn't kidding when she called the river narrow. You couldn't even stick your arm out of the boat without it getting torn off. How Krieg even attempted to get his galleon up the mountain was a mystery. Luffy had to deploy himself as a bumper a couple of times to stop Mary from crashing into the crags at the side of the mountain. Boy, did it hurt. Looked like there was an upper limit to how much blunt trauma he could take, but considering it took being shoved bin a literal continent, and a boat being pushed with the force of an ocean current, Luffy wasn't too worried. Thinking of Nami, it seemed their talk from last night had been beneficial. She was concerned and nervous for sure, being on the other side of it. Luffy couldn't blame her, but she faced the day completely focused on the task at hand and got them through safely. She was super cool like that. Lightning flashed. 10, 11, 12. RUMBLE. Boo! Someone yelled from far too close behind him. Ah! Luffy leapt out of his skin in fright. In trying to jump to his feet to meet the person who had snuck up on him, he misjudged his footing on Mary's head and began to fall. Luckily, he managed grabbed on to the figurehead with his arms, but the force of which he fell slung him down towards the ocean below. In a desperate attempt to avoid an unexpected salt water bath, Luffy lifted his legs up as high as he could. only for his rear to be dunked firmly into the water. Ah! So cold! He yelled, now begging for his arms to sling him back up to the ship. The rubber man got his wish and was pulled back up. He smacked into Mary's head and immediately wrapped his legs around her neck, now clinging on for dear life. Who the hell snuck up on him like that? It was such an asshole thing to do. He looked to the deck only to be greeted by a ginger woman, bent over clutching at her stomach, laughing hysterically. Of course it was Nami. Oh. You're awake too. Ah ha 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 ha. I am. Ha ha. So you. She could barely form words with how much she was laughing. With that out of the way, Nami! What the hell? Luffy yelled, incensed, but it only served to make Nami laugh harder. I nearly fell into the ocean. I could have died. Weren't you the one lecturing me about not dying? Oh, calm down, you big baby, Nami said, pulling back to laughter to mere giggle. You're fine. Besides, the ocean is plenty calm tonight. I could have easily pulled you out by myself. That's not the point, Luffy shouted back, not having it. Nami tooted playfully. A Cheshire grin spread across her face. Had I known sneaking up on you would have turned you into a wimp, I'd have not bothered, she teased. His navigator held out her hand, offering to help pull him back on board from his precarious position. He took it gladly, wanting something solid underneath him again. A curious thing Luffy couldn't help but note was how callous her hand was. He was sure he'd held it before at some point, but he was only noticing it now for some reason. Weird. Well, it's not like it mattered. With Nami's help, Luffy climbed back aboard the ship and plopped his, now soaking, backside on the deck. Nami stood over him, grinning like the cat that caught the canary. Enjoy your swim? She teased. Luffy pulled a sour face. Jerk. Oh come on, Luffy, you have to admit it was at least kind of funny, Nami said, getting down on her haunches to get on the same level as Luffy. I mean, ye yelped. I've never heard ye yelp before. The memory sent her into another fit of giggles. Luffy softened a bit at the sight on her, hand over mouth, laughing merrily. It was nice to see, even if it was at his expense, only 'cause you've never snuck up on me before, he said, still sounding a bit put out. Nami gave him a sly smirk. Then I'll just have to do it more often then, won't I? A challenge. Nope, Luffy declared. You caught me off guard before, but I won't let it happen again, if you say so. Huh? What's that supposed to mean? It means, if you're so confident you can try, she said with a shrug, smiling patronizingly. Of course I will. He meant it too. Nami only got him because he was so focused on the storm. I'm gonna be more aware from now on. His navigator patted him on the cheek. Sure you will. Hey, it's not like you'll actually be able to sneak up on me to begin with, Luffy said, becoming indignant. Nami just laughed. Luffy, you do remember I am a thief, right? And not just any thief, but one of, if not the best in East Blue. Sneaking is what I'm good at. Luffy had actually forgotten. He'd been so wrapped up in everything else, and the fact that Nami was his navigator first and foremost, her other occupation, had completely slipped his mind. That was kind of surprising because that was part of why Luffy thought Nami was so cool to begin with. Oh yeah? Luffy said. I forgot. Of course you did, Nami said with a sigh. Doesn't mean you're gonna do it, he muttered. Okay then. How's about we make a deal? Nami said, holding out her hand, the tips of her pointer finger and thumb pressed together. A sign she was feeling greedy. He wasn't sure why, but it made Luffy gulp. Still, he was never one to back down from a challenge. Yeah, what you got in mind? Nami's grin became ominous. 1 week. I have 1 week to see if I can scare 3 times, like I did just there. Okay. Easy enough. What's the prizes? With every word that came out of his mouth, Luffy couldn't help but feel he was digging his own grave. Well, in the unlikely event that I lose, I'll double your budget for food for a week, Nami offered. Luffy could feel his stomach rumble at the thought of extra food. It took a significant amount of willpower to not bite her hand off then and there. And if you win? He was almost hesitant to ask. I get to wear your hat for a day, she said. Nami's tone was confident, firm and expectant. There was a moment of hesitation, as Luffy considered it. He had every reason not to. Hell, even just the principle of the matter. But most of it boiled down to he didn't trust her. Which couldn't be further from the truth. Okay, wait, what? Nami looked gobsmacked, like Sanji had just come out and French Ed Zoro. We have a deal, Luffy said. Just like that? Nami sputtered. He just nodded at her with a wide smile. Yeah. It's not like I haven't let you wear it before. I trust you. He laughed. Besides, it's not like you're gonna win. I won't allow it. Nami swallowed. A bead of sweat formed down the side of her face. Was she only joking about the wager? What? Luffy asked. Did you not mean it? She shook her head furiously. No, I just didn't expect you to say yes is all. She laughed nervously. My other option was to have you wear a sandwich board that said I'm a huge coward. For a day or something. Luffy pulled a face. I think I'd prefer you wearing my hat. Honestly, I thought you'd prefer the sandwich board. Nami said. Nah, I'm good. Luffy stuck out his hand and Nami took it. With a firm they sealed the deal. So 1 week to scare me 3 times, yeah? Yup, starting tomorrow, then I get your hat for a whole day. Like hell you will. We'll see about that. They stared at each other, daring the other to blink first. Neither one willing to give in. This was a matter of pride. Luffy wouldn't lose the challenge, or this. Are you Mbele? Ah! They both screamed, jumping to their feet trying to get away from the colossal roll of thunder. There was a pause. Both of them looked like they had just had the life scared out of them. Luffy slowly turned to look at Nami, who in turn had turned to look at him. They wore the same startled expression. Doesn't count? He asked. Doesn't count. She confirmed. No need to worry then. They both took a seat on the deck, now taking in the view of the storm that Luffy had been appreciating before Nami so rudely interrupted. Hey Nami, you know you can tell how far away a storm is by how a gap there is between the thunder and lightning? Luffy asked enthusiastically. Maybe he knew something she didn't about weather. That's be cool. Nami nodded. Yup. It's really cool, huh? So much for that then. It really is. Luffy agreed. I think this one is about 13 miles away. Lightning flashed. They both waited intently for the following thunder. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. They counted together. Are you Mbele? Oh neat. New record. Luffy said, grinning. Nami whistled. That is some distance away. She paused for a moment, her eyes moving between the bow of the Mary and the storm. Yeah, 15 miles looks about right. Wow, you can actually tell the distance? Of course I can. I'd be a shit navigator if I couldn't. She said, as if stating the obvious. Awesome. Then it occurred to Luffy, hey, we don't need to worry about this storm, do we? Nami closed her eyes and tilted her head up towards the sky for a second. Nope. Air pressure is pretty high over here. Plus we got the wind behind us, so we should be safe for now. Now that was awesome. She could get a read on the weather like that without any fancy gadgets, or whatever normal navigators used. Luffy considered himself super lucky to have found Nami. Who knew he'd get such an amazing navigator along with a friend? From there they lapsed into silence. Comfortable, companionable silence. The only exception being when they counted between the thunder and lightning. Hey Luffy, how much sleep do you actually get? Nami asked. How much sleep? What a weird question. I dunno, about 5 hours, why? He replied. Wait, only 5? Nami said, sounding surprised. How on earth do you dash? I can't barely function without at least 8. 8? Who would want to lay about for so long? Luffy retorted, sounding just as surprised. Any rational human. Well, it's boring. You can't adventure if you're asleep. Luffy declared. Besides, why do you want to know? It's not like it's important. Nami shook her head. No real reason. I was just curious. You're always awake late at night like this, but you're always awake when I get up in the morning. The only exception being after a big fight. Ah, that makes sense. Luffy said, humming his agreement. Well, you're starting to stay up later as well. TSK, yeah. And I'm sleeping in later too, Nami sighed. It's such a pain though. I feel like I'm missing out on stuff. Then just sleep less. Nami held her arms in an X in front of her. No way. I like my sleep, thank you very much. She said, besides, I like our late night talks. So, I think I'm getting more than I'm missing. Nami looked at him with a wide smile. Shishishi. That's fair. Luffy replied, happily, I do too. It makes the late nights far more fun. I second that. Nami said. She suddenly snapped her fingers like she just remembered something. Speaking of sleeping, what do you make of our new stowaways? Luffy said dumbly. It took a second for pieces to click as to who Nami was referring to. Oh, the dancer and the guy with the weird hair. Yeah, them. What do you think? He shrugged. There wasn't really much to them. Really, I dunno, they seem nice. Nami raised an eyebrow. Nice? They tried to kill Laboon and then us. Okay, that was pretty mean of them. Luffy admitted, but they're just wanting to get home, right? Besides, we beat them once, we can beat them again. I guess so, Nami said, just something doesn't seem right, you know? She looked warily at the log pose she'd gotten from Old Man Crocus. It just seems convenient that their home is our first stop. The way they talked about it, it's meant to be some pirate haven. If it is, makes sense that they'd call it home. Luffy said if they try something, like I said, we beat them once, we can do it again. I'll take your word for it. Nami said, but she didn't look convinced. Come on, Nami! We're on the Grand Line! Luffy exclaimed, jumping to his feet, arms spread out, gesturing to the sea around them. Thunder rolled with his words, hammering the point home. You got us over Reverse Mountain, no problem at all. There's no time to be worried. Nami looked up at him, her face slowly splitting into a wide grin. Yeah, you're right. We'll get there when we get there. She hopped up to join him. What's the worst that could happen? Shishishi. That's the spirit. It's like Ace always said, life's not long enough to be concerned. Luffy said, ignoring the fact that he butchered the quote, or was it Gramps that said that? I don't remember. Nami giggled, probably at how poor he quoted the saying. Who's Ace, by the way? She asked. You've never mentioned him before. Oh, Ace? He's my big brother? Luffy said with a laugh. Wait, you have a big brother? Nami asked, once more looking gobsmacked. Why didn't you say? You never asked, he replied casually. Were you ever gonna mention you had a sister if we didn't meet her? Aye, but that was… She stammered a bit. Okay, fair enough. How was Ace doing? Luffy wondered. It had been so long since he set out on his adventure. Last Luffy had heard, he'd gotten himself a massive bounty, but that was about it. What's he like? Ace, that is. Nami was asking a lot of questions tonight, but she looked genuinely curious. So Luffy was only too happy to oblige. He's the coolest guy I know, he said proudly. We used to train and spar together all the time growing up. We fought like 100 times a day. She hummed, sounding impressed. Nami probably thought that he was exaggerating. If only she knew. Never once did I beat him. Was this before or after you ate the gum-gum fruit? Well, after. Holy crap. He sounds like a monster. Nami said. Where's he now? No idea. He set sail like 3 years ago, so we might run into him at some point then? Luffy shrugged. Probably. Who knows? He chuckled to himself. I hope so. I bet I could beat him in a fight now. Shishishi. Nami shook her head fondly. Sure, if he was still a kid. Hey! I could totally beat Ace now. He shot back. If he was still a kid? Nami was smirking at him now. Like she knew any better. You've never met Ace, how would you know? I've never met him and I'm still sure he'd kick your ass. She countered. Besides, if he's anything like you, he's probably even more of a monster than you, especially with a 3-year head start. Like hell. I'm 10 times stronger than him. At this point Luffy was glowering indignantly at Nami, while just kept smirking. How infuriating. He was half tempted to go find Ace just to prove his point. Once more Nami pat him on the cheek. Sure thing, buddy. Whatever helps you sleep at night. Luffy just huffed and turned away petulantly, arms folded. This sent Nami into a fit of giggles. Oh come on, Luffy. She said. I wasn't serious. I'm sure you take him. Luffy turned back to her looking hopeful. But she broke out laughing again. And if you can't do it, I'll beat him up for you. Nami! He whined. It's not funny. Nami just laughed harder. Oh, on the contrary. I think it's hilarious. She continued her laughing for ages. Luffy sat back down, chin resting on the heel of his palm, scowling comically. Slowly Nami's laughter slowed into giggles, then she finally stopped, breathing deeply. Oh, that was funny, she sighed. Come on, tough guy. That storm's dissipating, time for bed. Nami grabbed Luffy by the arm. He reluctantly got to his feet and let her drag him back inside. As much of a sour face he pulled a sour face, he knew she was only teasing. It's what she did. Especially when it was just the two of them here out on deck together. Luffy really did like to see her so carefree. So why did it bother him that Nami was teasing him about not being able to beat someone in a fight? 2 years. It had been 2 years since Vivi had left her home of Alabasta in an attempt to save it. She left with her attendant and close friend Igaram with the aim of infiltrating Baroque works. Vivi was 14 at the time. It was hell. During that time Vivi had to work for the very people trying to tear her country apart. But it was the only way. They needed information. Everything from general operations, to hierarchy of staff, to the ING swabbies on the billion ships. Nothing was superfluous. Slowly but surely, both she and Igaram worked their way into the organization, rising through the ranks to become numbered agents. They'd picked up on some of the most crucial information possible. Mr. Zero's identity. The royal warlord of the sea, Sir Crocodile. But it had been for naught. They'd been fooled. Miss All Sunday had let them get that information, fully aware of who they were and what they wanted. Now, she held it over Vivi's head. She would have told Crocodile by now, and they would be fully expecting their arrival in Alabasta. It all looked hopeless. Everything Vivi and Igaram had suffered through was in vain. Yet Vivi did not feel defeated. As desolate as things had become, with a view of becoming much worse, she held a small glimmer of hope that things would be all right. Hope in the form of a small pirate crew. The Straw Hats. It was an odd situation to say the least. Here they were escorting her back to her country, willing help her in her battles with Baroque works, when not but a few days ago she'd both tried to kill them, then lead them to the trap that was Whiskey Peak. Honestly, Vivi couldn't make heads or tails of them. The Straw Hats had been sympathetic to her plight, once she shared it. The captain, Luffy, didn't even blink when Crocodile's name had been mentioned. If anything, he seemed more eager to help. Even if the rest of the crew had a bit more to say on the matter. Still, Vivi had been shocked by their kindness. It was because of them all hope had not been lost. The Straw Hats would bring Vivi home so that she may mend the rift that was slowly being dredged in her beloved country. However, it did not mean the task of facing down Baroque works was not still daunting. The Straw Hats were a crew of 5 against the literal thousands at Baroque works' disposal, and the senior members alone would be near impossible to beat. The memory of their encounter with Miss All Sunday flashed through Vivi's mind. That woman was terrifying. She had not only snuck onto the Going Merry with everyone none the wiser, but disarmed and disabled the entire crew without so as batting an eyelid. The meeting didn't come to blows, but Vivi had a horrible pit in her stomach that it wouldn't have ended well if it had. Luckily Miss All Sunday was only there to deliver a message. No, a warning, but despite the clear and tangible threat to their lives, the pirates did not back down. They held firm in their promise to help Vivi. Luffy even rejected an eternal pose to Alabasta when told the next stop, Little Garden, may take years to get away from. The determination on display was enviable. So, here Vivi lay, 2 days later. In a hammock, strung up by an improvised yet sturdy rack in the Going Merry's women's quarters, staring at the roof at a, quite frankly, ungodly hour of the night. So many thoughts and feelings churned through her head. The fear and sadness for what was happening in her beloved homeland. The happiness and joy of meeting the Straw Hats. The grief of watching Igaram's ship being blown up. Vivi's heart clenched. The explosion of his ship echoed through her mind with painful clarity. The heat from the blast still warmed her skin. Igaram was dead. Her friend had given his life to help her get away. Tears burned in her eyes. Vivi sat up in the hammock, rocking it in the process. She curled her legs up into herself and buried her face into her knees. They'd gotten away, but only at the whim of their enemy. Vivi could still hear Igaram's goofy laugh, and see the steel in his eyes as he sent them off so he could serve as a distraction to aid their getaway. She missed him. She sat like this for several minutes, desperately trying to stifle the sound of her sobs. Hopefully she didn't wake Nami. That was if Nami had even made it to bed. Either way it didn't matter. It was long past midnight. Everyone surely had to be in bed by now. Vivi lay back down. She needed to get to sleep. There was no way to know when they would get to Little Gardens, so she had to be fully rested just in case. The longer Vivi lay, the harder sleep came. She tossed and turned but just couldn't get comfortable. The air was becoming thick and stifling, making it hard to breathe. Her blanket felt like it was made of hot lead. She was far too clammy, and it felt like she'd been kicked at the base of her skull. Vivi needed some air. Tiptoeing towards the stairs to the upper deck, Vivi was thankful the ship was so tidy. She would have broken her foot 5 times already. When she stepped into the kitchen, the air was already lighter, cooler, and fresher. It was uplifting. Vivi took a deep breath. The salty air filled her lungs and expanding her chest. Oh, how refreshing it was. Mumbled speech sounded through the cabin. Vivi stopped dead. People were up? Who would be up at a time like this? There it was again. But it sounded different this time. There were 2 people up. Vivi walked up to the porthole by the door to peer out onto the deck. The sky was largely clear, only partially broken up by clouds. The deck itself was bathed in moonlight, but no one was to be seen, though that might have something to do with the main mast blocking a large portion of the view. So, moving as slowly as possibly, Vivi cracked open the door outside to try and get an ear on whoever was talking. "Damn! I thought I had you with that one," came Nami's voice. "Well, you're go now." Replied Luffy's voice. "I spy with my little eye something beginning with." They were playing a game? Vivi shook her head. This was not what she was expecting. It wasn't even on the list of things for her to expect. The captain and navigator of the pirate crew that saved her life were playing a children's game, outside, in the middle of the night. How strange. Opening the door a bit more, she moved to try and get a look at them, slowly shuffling along the wall to poke her head around the mast. Luffy and Nami were sitting back to back in the middle of the deck. Luffy, without his ever-present hat, was looking out the port side of the ship, grinning confidently. Nami, wearing her captain's straw hat, was looking around her, searching for anything beginning with her given letter. It was an odd sight to say the least. In the 2 days Vivi had been on the Going Merry, one rule had been clearly established: do not touch the captain's hat. So for Nami to be wearing it so casually, probably meant the 2 were closer than Vivi originally thought. "Iron," Nami said. "Nope," Luffy replied, popping the P. "Island." She tried again. Vivi looked around. There were no islands in sight. "Nah." "Icicle." "Nah." Again, Vivi looked around. No ice to be seen. Iridescent. Was Nami even taking this seriously? Vivi could only wonder. "Now you're just making up words," Luffy said with a laugh. "It's a real word. I wanted to see if you knew it." Nami replied easily. "Doesn't matter, that ain't it." The captain sounded confident in his coming victory. "Alright, I give." "What is it?" She didn't sound too put out by admitting defeat. Luffy's grin widened. Nami whirled around onto her knees and punched her captain on the back of the head. "Dumbass. I doesn't begin with an I." She hissed. "You told me you were literate." Vivi blinked once. Blinked twice. Blinked a third time. Was he really that dumb? "Well, it sounds like it does. So I thought it'd count." Luffy turned to Nami, clutching the swiftly swelling lump on the back of his head. Oh gods, he was. She felt queasy. This was the man Vivi was trusting to help save her beloved homeland. Alabasta was doomed. "Like hell it does." "I starts with an E," Nami said. "Besides, whose eye could you even see? We were sitting against each other." "Well, I couldn't think of anything, so I thought of yours," he replied as if it was obvious. "Biba, that's not how any of this works," Nami stammered, looking a little pink around the ears. "So I didn't win?" Luffy asked like it just occurred to him. "No. You lose for being a dumbass," Nami snapped. "Damn." He snapped his fingers like it was some kind of close call. At that moment Nami looked ready to slug him again, and Vivi can't help but giggle at the view. The whole interaction was a bit surreal for her. She knew this crew was a bit eccentric, but this was something else. Both Nami and Luffy looked up, having heard her laugh. They caught her eye at the same time. "Oh, you're awake too," they said. There was a pause. Then they broke out laughing as if it was some kind of hilarious in-joke. Vivi just chuckled nervously and waved at them. Nami pat the ground beside them. "Come on over," she said. "Take a seat." Vivi nodded and went to join them in the middle of the deck. "So Nami started can't sleep, huh?" Yeah, something like that," Vivi replied, sounding somewhat sheepish. "It's all right," Nami said, with a small, sympathetic smile. "That's how it started out for me too. You'll get through it." It felt as if Nami really did know what Vivi was going through. The kind look in her eye barely covered hurt Nami was feeling, or at least, had felt. The certainty with which the navigator spoke went a long way to helping settle Vivi churning emotions. Interestingly enough, Luffy watched this subtle, unspoken exchange with a neutral expression, being unusually silent. Maybe he too understood what she was going through. Or maybe he just knew it wasn't his time to speak. "Thank you," Vivi said simply. Both Luffy and Nami broke into wide grins. "So, do you two come out and sit like this often?" Luffy nodded. "Yup. It's a tradition now." They must have been doing this for quite a while then. These two were certainly closer than first anticipated. "No, you idiot," Nami chopped her captain on the back of the head with a weary sigh. I said it was becoming tradition, not that it was. She turned to Vivi. This is only the 6th or 7th time we've been out here like this. Ah, so they were getting there. Oh, okay, I see. Vivi said, so what brought it about? She was genuinely curious. Nami was the only other girl on the ship, so Vivi wanted to get to know her better, and for as simple as Luffy seemed, she got the feeling there was more to him than met the eye. There's not much to it really, Nami said with a shrug. I had a couple nights where I couldn't sleep, much like yourself, so I came up on deck for some air, and because Luffy doesn't sleep much, he kept me company. Since then, it's just become a thing we do. It was as simple an explanation as one could expect really. Without prying into why Nami couldn't sleep, Luffy nodded along, backing up what Nami was saying. I really like it, he said, smiling happily. It's a lot better having company like this. Nami hummed. Definitely. It's nice to just sit and chat without having to worry about anything. It's relaxing. It really sounded like it. Granted, we do sit inside, or just straight up don't both if the weather is bad, she explained. Speaking of which, Nami trailed off. She closed her eyes and tilted her head skyward. Vivi watched, curious as to what Nami could be doing. The navigator opened her eyes a couple seconds later and looked at the log pose on her wrist. Luffy, can you steer the ship 10 degrees to starboard? Sure. Luffy hopped to his feet and began to walk in the direction of the cabin before pausing mid-step. Which direction is that? He asked lamely. Hold the steering to the right for a couple seconds. Will do. And he was off again. Vivi looked back to Nami. She had this odd expression on her face. It was a mixture of fondness, gladness, and something else entirely. Vivi had seen it before in the mirror. You like him, don't you? Nami's head spun around so fast it gave Vivi whiplash. Her ears were burning a bright pink, and her eyes as wide as dinner plates. Vivi panicked. She had pride where she shouldn't have. She really shouldn't have said anything. Oh goodness, what if she just ruined it? They'd hate her. Oh, this was bad. Really, really bad, and no. Nami stammered, waving her hands frantically. I don't really like him like that. He's my captain and my friend. Not to mention a complete moron. There's no way I could like him like that. Vivi grabbed the navigator's desperately flapping hands. It's fine. If you don't, you don't, she said in hurried attempt to calm Nami. I spoke out of place. It's my fault. That seemed to work. Nami took a deep, calming breath, the redness in her ears slowly fading away. In Vivi's mind, all that little scene had done was back up her claim. But if you don't mind me asking, you do feel something for him? She spoke lowly, in an attempt to not be overheard. Nami's gaze dropped to her hands, currently still being held by Vivi, rest on her lap. She nodded slowly, as if ashamed. It's just a crush, she said. Luffy saved my life. My whole island. I had been stuck as pawn to a pirate for 8 years. My hometown was held to ransom. Then Luffy came, and without even asking why, freed me from that life, and then offered me the chance to fulfill my dream. Her tone had become wistful and full of admiration for the man in question. To Vivi it made so much sense. This was the pain Nami had felt before, and Luffy saved her. It's only natural she'd feel something for her savior. Nami looked up with a shaky smile and met Vivi's gaze. It's just a childish crush, really. It'll be gone before you know it. She reached up and grabbed the edge of the straw hat. She sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than anything. It must have been difficult for Nami. If what she said was true, then her problem started when she was 10, so she has probably never had a crush on someone before, and being the only girl on the ship for the longest time didn't help, as she'd have had no one to talk to. Vivi's heart went out to her. She had friends, family, and attendants she could talk to. Nami didn't have any of that right now. What are you guys whispering about? Luffy asked, appearing from nowhere. The two girls startled at the captain's sudden appearance. The tender and vulnerable moment shattered like glass. Nami gripped the brim of the hat and pulled it down over her face, mostly fearing that she'd been overheard by the very guy they were talking about. Vivi needed to think quick. You know, Jay just girl things, Vivi said. Hopefully that would throw him off. Luffy pulled a face like he just sucked on a lemon. That's fair. He took his seat back down beside them with a small huff. Nami, I did what you said. Just barely the hat from her face. Nami looked at the log pose. The needle had changed direction a few degrees, but they were largely still on course. Why had they needed to change direction in the first place? Nami nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good, you went a bit further than 10 degrees, but we should still be fine, she said, finally moving the hat back to the top of her head. We'll just have to turn it back when we go to bed. Why did you need to change cour? Vivi was cut off by the sound of rolling thunder. She looked up and sure enough, dark clouds were rapidly forming up ahead and to the left of the Going Merry. Judging by where they were forming, they'd have run straight into them had Nami not ordered the change of course. How on earth did she do that? Apparently Vivi was wearing her amazement on her face as Nami looked at her with a cocky smile and gave her a cheeky wink. Pretty amazing, huh? Luffy said, completely unsurprised. Nami's the best navigator there is. No kidding. Vivi whispered, how did you know? I didn't see anything. Vivi knew a thing or two about navigation. Between her and Mr. Nine, she was the only one even willing to learn. The arrogant prick. He left her to navigate them from job to job. But this was something else entirely. I can read air pressure and temperature really easily. It was a knack I discovered when I was a kid. I didn't know what to do with it at first, but I managed to train myself to know when storms are coming. Nami explained. It was a lot of trial and error, but I got the hang of it eventually. Pretty neat, huh? I'll say, Luffy exclaimed. It seemed like this was the first time he had heard this too, but I bet you got shipwrecked a lot too. Nami laughed lightly. Only once. I got super lucky and was picked up once the storm passed. After that, I kept myself to shore when practicing. That made sense. Vivi was amazed Nami wasn't put off sailing entirely by the ordeal. Getting shipwrecked wasn't exactly a minor thing one could shake off. So, Vivi, what's kept you up so late? Nami asked. Stuff. She said, just couldn't sleep. Must have been something I ate, haha, that doesn't sound right. Luffy said, head tilted to the side. Sanji's food is never bad. Didn't he ask you about stuff you can't eat when you joined? Sanji had. It was the only moment that Sanji spoke to her that didn't involve him fawning over her. The chef took his work very seriously. Nami grinned, looking like the proverbial cat he did. I was there when it happened. Shit, she was. Vivi was sweating. She really didn't want to share why she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced as she struggled to think of a suitable excuse. Her eyes shifted frantically from side to side, trying to find something, anything. If you don't want to say, you don't have to, Luffy said, but when you do, we'll listen. Right, Nami? Vivi got the feeling it wasn't really a question. Nami nodded. Her devilish grin faded back to that understanding smile from before. Was she just teasing her? Relief flushed through Vivi in waves. Thank the gods Luffy was so understanding. She knew Nami had shown a lot of trust in sharing her feelings, but this. Vivi just couldn't. It was too soon. Too fresh. From there they lapsed into silence. Not saying anything, just enjoying each other's company. There was something special about silences like these, Vivi thought, where you didn't feel awkward, or like you were obligated to say or do anything. You just enjoyed being in the presence of your friends. And they were friends to Vivi. Given what these people were willing to risk for her in the short time they'd known each other, she was proud to call them friends. And given the looks Nami was stealing when Luffy wasn't looking, and surprisingly enough, vice versa. Maybe something more, in due time. Nami slouched back against Mary's main mast, knocking her knees together, humming a tune. Luffy was still hanging out with Usopp and the others. Vivi and Kuro had long since gone to bed, so Nami decided to take some peace out on deck while waiting on the rubber man. She developed a bit of a headache, so the cool night air was doing her nicely. They had left Little Garden earlier that day and were now heading for Alabasta proper, but that was going to take at least a week of straight travel. Thankfully Dory and Broggy had been kind enough to help them stock up. Looking back on it, Little Garden had been more of a shit show than first anticipated. Originally, it was meant to be a big, ominous island where the main threat was being stranded there for 3 years while the log pose reset. A pretty problem in its own right. It was faith alone that stopped Nami from tying her captain's limbs in a knot, and throwing him overboard for refusing a compass that literally pointed to where they wanted to go, completely avoiding Little Garden entirely. But then again, given who was offering it, it was probably some kind of trap. So 6 to 1, half a dozen to the other, that Miss All-Sunday woman was scary. But what they hadn't been expecting was an island full of Baroque Works agents, a pair monstrous giants and mothering dinosaurs. Then, As if to add insult to injury, Nami had been bitten by a bug. The bite itself hadn't been so bad, it was just a bug bite after all. What really pissed Nami off about it was that it left the ugliest bruise. It was no bigger than a 10-berry piece, but it was the most horrible shade of green and purple. So much for wearing cute bikini tops to islands. Still, at least they got away faster than the predicted several years. Nami sighed, looking up to the clear sky. All the constellations were visible tonight, and the weather was stable. It kind of reminded Nami of the first night on the Mary. She smiled softly at the memory. Gods, that seemed so long ago. So much can happen in, what, a month and a half, 2 months. Arlong had been defeated, they'd traveled to the Grand Line, and gotten involved in a clandestine plot to overthrow a major nation, led by a royal warlord of the sea in which there was a pretty big chance they would all be killed. Nami buried her head in her hands and groaned. How did this happen? Couldn't have been as simple as it was in East Blue? Where the pirates were just pompous assholes that Luffy and or Zoro could just walk over. But Vivi needed them, though. She was relying on them to help her take down Baroque Works, warlord or not. Nami slapped her cheeks. She needed to toughen up. She wouldn't always be able to fall back on Luffy and the others to fight battles for her. Her head throbbed. How could she keep up? No, how could she catch up? Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji had been training to fight ever since they were kids. They were basically prodigies in their respective fields. Even Usopp, for as wimpy as he was in a tete-a-tete, his aim was so accurate Nami could swear he could see past the curvature of the earth. It was ridiculous. She rested her head back on the main mast. Now, she was never one to be shy about her abilities or achievements. For one, her navigational skills were second to none. She could even read the weather in ways most navigators could only dream of. Not to mention her penchant for thieving kleptomania, as Mr. Jen would call it, was as good as anyone else. You don't steal 100-odd million berries by being a novice thief. But when it came to combat, Nami was just, alright. Good enough. Can get by. Her skills with a bow staff were good, when compared to the average Joe, and that had been plenty. She could defend herself when things got hairy, helped by the fact she was underestimated for being a cute girl, but out here, on the Grand Line, she was fodder at best, and that fact settled in her like a rock. Her head throbbed. Just as Nami was about to close her eyes, the top of a straw hat popped into her peripheral vision. Ah, so the others had finally gone to bed. Boo! He yelled. Completely unmoved, Nami glanced over at her captain. Oh, you're awake too. The shoe was on the other foot tonight. Luffy, who had apparently been on his hands and knees in his attempt to sneak up on her, collapsed onto his stomach and groaned. Naami. He whined. It's not fair that you can sneak up on me, but I can't sneak up on you. He stuck out his bottom lip petulantly, his hat having dropped over his forehead and eyes. Nami looked down at him fondly. He'd been trying to get revenge on her ever since she won their little bet a few days back. She'd won in about 2 days of trying, by the by. Unfortunately for Luffy, he was rubbish at stealth. Every attempt he made was either in a room with multiple people, who all glanced at him when he approached, or he gave himself away too early by giggling to himself, or, like he just did, getting into her eye line. It was both comical and endearing. That's because, Luffy, she began with a smug grin, you're like a bull in a china shop. You can't sneak for shit. The half-hearted glare he shot her from under his hat was straight up hilarious. But I managed it the other night when you and Vivi were talking, he exclaimed. True, but we weren't expecting it. A seagull shitting on the ground too close to us would have made us jump. Nami retorted with a smirk. Then teach me, Luffy demanded. Nami placed a finger on her chin. She genuinely considered giving it a go, as the thought of Luffy trying to sneak about the ship was goldmine of comedy. Ultimately, it was probably for the best she didn't. The amount of effort she'd have to put in versus what he's get out was about as unbalanced as it could get. Her head ached at the thought of trying to teach him the values of being patient. Naya. Don't want to be giving away trade secrets now, do I? Not fair. He moaned. Hey, you get ungodly strength and vitality, Nami said with nonchalant shrug. I get to be sneaky and good-looking. Luffy didn't look satisfied. I'll tell you what's unfair, she said, pinching Luffy's cheek and pulling it. You get to eat as much as you want, and not put on a single pound. What's the gotta do why anything, he said, looking, not confused, more curious. Oh, how Nami wished she could have his attitude towards food. What? You think I look this good naturally? Nami let go of his cheek, and positioned herself to rest on her elbow, and one leg, giving Luffy a full view of her body. She ran her hand up her leg, waist, and chest, trying to bring attention to her shapely curves. "I gotta work hard to keep this in S," she said teasingly, giving Luffy a saucy wink. Now, any lesser man would have flushed bright pink at her showing off her figure like this. Many in the past had. Her t-shirt, while covering her torso completely, was snug and her breasts strained against it nicely as they tried to fall to earth, while her short shorts were tight against her legs, showing off their shape wonderfully, while leaving just enough to the imagination. All in all, Nami felt she looked gorgeous. Of course, to a less clod like Luffy, that meant sweet jack shit. He looked her up and down multiple times, his eyes staring intently as if trying to divine the meaning of life, the universe, and everything with each once over. Nami might have just been imagining it, but she could swear he was spending a bit more time on her legs than the rest of her. Though, that might have just been wishful thinking. Also, she was definitely imagining the tips of his ears turning ever so slightly pink. It must have been the cold. "Nope, I don't get it," Luffy declared. "You look fine however much you eat." He chuckled. "Besides, you can eat whatever you want. You could just work it off later, anyways." "Gee, thanks for the advice," Nami muttered. It's not like that's what she hadn't been doing. She wasn't exactly a fussy eater, but she was careful about what she ate. Having Sanji as a cook certainly helped. "I think I'll go eat an entire buffet now." "Shishishi, that's the spirit." Luffy laughed, her sarcasm flying over his head with a clear whistle. Nami slouched back against the mast again, this time feeling a little deflated. "I don't even know what I was expecting from you." What had she been expecting? For him to turn beet red and start stammering over her beauty? He wasn't Sanji. She knew Luffy's libido probably that of a 5-year-old, so of course he wouldn't go for it. Oh well, he did compliment her at least. That was something. Her head throbbed. "So what you been up to?" Luffy asked, sitting up beside her. He was close enough that she could feel his body heat on her bare arm. "It was nice." "Not much," Nami replied. "Was just enjoying the peace and quiet before you came to ruin it." "That's so?" Luffy laughed. "Well, I'm here now, so what's up?" Nami raised an eyebrow at him. "What makes you think something is up?" "I dunno, you just look not well," he said with a shrug. "You don't say," Nami said. "It's not, just an annoying headache. I'll drink some water before bed." It was just dehydration. She hadn't drank much since dinner, and most of the pain was around her forehead. "An easy fix." Don't we have any of those whatchamacallyms?" Luffy struggled to find the word. He folded his arms and pressed his finger to his forehead in an attempt to try and recall. "Grandpa used to take them all the time when he dealt with me and Ace." "Tablets? Aspirin?" Nami supplied, amused at the sight of Luffy's face turning red from exertion. It was adorable. "Ibuprofen? That's the one!" he exclaimed. "Eyebrow propane, that's not even close to right," Nami said flatly. "Doesn't matter." "Don't we have any of that?" Luffy asked. "Sadly not," she replied. "We used the last of it after Whiskey Peak, trying to cure everyone's hangover. They did drink a lot that night." "Damn." Luffy snapped his fingers. "And we don't have a doctor either." Nami hummed. "Come to think of it, that's something we need to talk about." "Talk about what?" "Recruitment," Nami said, expression becoming hard. This was not something she'd take lightly. Before they'd always talked as comrades, but now they needed to be pirates. And just like that, Luffy's expression sobered up. The merry twinkle that was a near constant in his eyes extinguished, and wide smile he sported became nothing more than a thin, pursed line. The goofy, fun-loving, rubber man stepped aside for a second. The captain was now in attendance. "What about it?" he replied. The lack of any kind of positive emotion in his tone was straight up unnerving. Luffy was making it clear, he's taking this seriously. Nami paused to take a breath and consider her words. She was the unofficial second mate of the crew, she had the ear of the captain, and while on such a small crew it didn't mean much, it meant something. Her head throbbed. "We need more people." Luffy said nothing. He just staring at her intently, wanting her to elaborate. "Right now, we're a crew of what? 6 people? 7 if you include Karoo," she continued. "We're going up against Baroque Works, an organization of several thousand, run by a warlord, no less." He knew this. They all knew this. The situation had been made clear to them all when they got into this situation. The slight twitch in Luffy's brow told Nami she was just treading old ground. She needed to get to the point. We need more people, she stated. We barely cover enough of the bases as is. Some are even pulling double duty at times. We've been stupidly lucky to make it as far as we have without a doctor. I'm not gonna recruit just anybody for the sake of filling a role, Nami, Luffy said. His words were stern, but not harsh. His tone was hard, but not cold. It sent a small shiver down Nami's spine. I only accept the best. I know that, she said. None of us would follow you if you didn't. What I'm trying to say is we can't go much longer as we are. We need a doctor, or someone who can fight. Hell, if we can find someone who can do both, that would be perfect. Her head throbbed. Back on Little Garden, just those 4 agents gave us the runaround. Mr. 3 was on the verge of turning us into statues. Miss Goldenweek had you drinking tea while that happened. Nami tapped her finger onto the deck between them, trying to, in some way, stress the point. Zoro tried to cut his ing feet off. What if he'd managed to go through with it? He'd be dead right now. Luffy did not look happy. He was scowling something fierce. Whether it was at her or at the memories she was invoking, Nami didn't know. I'm not asking you to recruit anybody, Luffy, she said gently, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. His expression lifted somewhat. I just mean that we can't waste any opportunities to do so. They stared at each other in silence. Nami, with one hand still on his shoulder, was willing him with all her might to understand. Luffy was looking back at her, unblinkingly. It felt like he was trying to read her soul or something. Nami pleaded with herself not to blush under the intensity of his gaze. Her face was feeling rather warm. Finally Luffy dipped his head. Yeah, you're right, he said with a sigh. I guess I'll make a point of it from here. Nami pulled Luffy into a hug. Her arms wrapped lightly around his neck. She rested her chin on his shoulder, and he did the same on her. Nami felt her ears blush when he wrapped his arms around her waist to hug her back. Thank you, she whispered. Nami didn't really know why she felt the need to do something like this, but Luffy actually listening to her, taking her advice on board when she wasn't barking orders at him, or having a go at him for being reckless. It meant a lot. She chalked it up to her stupid crush. Her head throbbed. Her captain might have been the kind of guy who could fly by the seat of his pants and hope for the best. Nami was not. She needed some form of plan, or insurance at least, for something to be done. Her captain's word was enough. She trusted him. They stayed like that for several minutes. Nami felt her eyes becoming heavier, and her body began weighing itself down. She yawned softly. When did she get so tired? She was feeling fine a couple minutes ago. Luffy apparently picked up on it, and, with her arms still around his neck, scoped her up bridal style with no effort whatsoever. It was nice. The gentle rocking of his steps as he walked to the women's quarters. By that point, Nami was essentially gone. She was vaguely aware of his chest rumbling as he spoke, probably to Vivi, apologizing for waking her. Nami didn't care. She was feeling nice and floaty, ready for sleep. She just wished her head would stop throbbing. 000. The next night, Luffy sat by Nami's bed. It was dark. No light permeated any part of the women's quarters, such was the quality of which it was built. But Luffy didn't need it. He didn't want it. The sight of Nami's sickly pallor had burned itself into his mind's eye. Skin was devoid of color, yet her cheeks were an angry red, as if they'd been burned with an iron. Sweat covered her skin in a sickly sheen, sticking her normally silky and well-kept hair to her head. Nami was sick, and if what Vivi and Sanji said was true, she might even die. No. He wouldn't let that happen. Luffy would never lose anyone again. Not if he could help it, but that was just it, wasn't it? Luffy couldn't help it. This was not some enemy he could fight. Something that simply being strong could do anything about. This was a disease. He couldn't do anything about it. He was helpless. That's not to say he didn't try. Luffy knew nothing about being sick. He'd never been sick. Ace had never been sick. Dayton and her bandits had all been sick multiple times. But with them Luffy had always been told they'll be fine in a few days, don't worry, and he never did. They were tough like that. Luffy offered everything he could think of, from food to ice, to trying to make Nami laugh. Grandpa always said laughter was the best medicine. Turns out that was a lie. With everything he tried, he was told he'd only be making Nami worse. Luffy stared into the darkness where he knew Nami's head was. Her breath was heavy and ragged. Like her body had convinced itself that it just needed more air. It almost drowned out the sound of everyone else sleeping in the room. He clenched his fists against his trousers. Nami had been right. They need more people. A doctor especially. It's not like Luffy hadn't been planning on recruiting more, he wanted a crew of 10 after all. But he had been playing it a bit fast and loose. Just traveling around until he found someone cool to join his crew. No real plan or intent in it until a particular role became needed. It was something he was now beginning to regret somewhat. His crewmate's life should not have to be put at risk for him to make a move. That's what Nami was telling him the previous night. Of course, there was no way, he or any of them for that matter could possibly have known Nami would fall sick so suddenly, and so badly. But that was the point. Nami had said they'd been lucky. For them to have been at sea for as long they had and for no one to have gotten sick was nothing short of a miracle. Luffy saw that now. He would not lose a single person on his crew. They were all special to him. Nami was special to him. Luffy absolutely refused to lose someone again. You know, we probably shouldn't sit out in the snow like this. Probably not. But it is really cool though, you're not wrong there. Still, we shouldn't be out here too long. It was only yesterday that I was bedridden, I guess. But we have a doctor now. It won't be so bad, for you at least. What's that supposed to mean? Idiots can't catch a cold. Oh yeah, wait. That's mean, Nami laughed, slapping her knee a couple times. Ha 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 ha, so you admit it. No, I don't. Luffy exclaimed, you're just being really tricky. You make it so easy. She said, it's like shooting fish in a barrel with you. Her captain turned away from her, arms folded. I do not. He muttered, you're just a witch. If that had come from Zoro, she'd would have had a go at him. Or doubled his debt. Again. But coming from Luffy, it was so weak and half-hearted it was pathetic. He was clearly just trying to copy their first mate in order to get some kind of rise out of her. Luffy literally could not insult anyone on their crew if he tried. It was too cute. Nami couldn't help but giggle at him. Looking at him now, one would hardly believe that Luffy was a pirate worth 30 million berry, or that he just defeated a tyrannical despot to help cure a nation. Here, he was just Luffy, rubber man and dumbass extraordinaire, a man who, one day would be taking down Vicious, then the next, nearly choked to death on a kebab because he wanted to eat all of the meat, but none of the vegetables. She wouldn't have him any other way. The witch doctor told Nami all about what Luffy had gone through to get her to the top of the mountain. Risking death by frostbite to carry her and Sanji all the way to the summit. All while barefoot. Then he begged Kureha to treat her and Sanji first, despite the fact he could have lost limbs in that time. Luffy really was something else. Nami looked out over Mary's deck. She and Luffy were sitting up against her railing, watching the snow drift gently down around them, resting on the deck in a thin, smooth sheet. They had set out from Drum Island rather late in the day, so they were still close enough that the climate would allow for such a peaceful snowfall. An oil lantern sat not 2 feet away from them, bathing the area in a warm, orange glow. It was straight up picturesque. The two of them sat under thick, duck-feathered duvet that had been bought from Drum before leaving, dressed in a pair of winter coats pilfered from Zoro and Vivi. Nami's shoulder brushed up against Luffy's. She couldn't help but enjoy how cozy they were, despite the cold that surrounded them. It all reminded Nami of winter back on Kokoyashi. Snow was always a special occasion, what with the island being tropical. It would come once, maybe twice, per year, and it always stuck around for days after. Belmere would let her and Nojiko stay up late to watch the snow fall during the night. The town had made something of a tradition out of it. They would light lanterns and fill the streets with them, till the whole town was lit up. Belmere would take them into two to watch. Everyone would remain quiet. The glow of the lanterns would cover the snow for miles and miles, filling the space with ethereal silence. Sound would carry far beyond what it would naturally. Something about snow reverberating sound really well. To a younger Nami, it was breathtaking. Her mother would always tell her on nights like these, magic happens. Those words echoed in Nami's mind as she watched the snow come to rest on the blanket that covered her, and Luffy's legs. Speaking of the dumbass, Nami looked up at him, only to meet his gaze. Had he been staring at her? He was looking pretty intent. So, probably, what? She asked lamely. He took a moment to react. You were thinking about something. Nami nodded. I was. Does that worry you? I dunno, he said, nonchalant. Should it? Nami just laughed. No, not this time. I was thinking how this snow reminded me of home. Her captain cocked his head to the side. Why? Did it snow a lot? He asked. Nope, she said, popping the pea, just the opposite, but that's what made it so special. She was starting to sound wistful now. We may not see any snow for a while, you know. Vivi said her home was a summer isle, covered in a vast desert, and I have no idea what the islands past that are like. It's just nice to appreciate it while we're here. Luffy didn't look away from her. He just watched as she spoke, hanging off of her every word. Nami noticed his eyes darting about her face, taking in every detail, like it was the first time he'd ever seen her. He looked enraptured. Her breath caught in her throat. The lamp light lit up one side of Luffy's face, casting the other in shadow. Pair that with the backdrop of the night behind him, and it gave him a look of maturity that Nami had never seen in him before. The light caught every curve of his cheekbone, and the line of his jaw. Was this what he'd look like in a few years' time? It took Nami a couple seconds before she remembered to breath. Finally, Luffy tore his eyes away from her, looking down at the lantern in front of them. Definitely, he said softly, nights like these are special. From there they lapsed into a comfortable silence. No need to talk. Just enjoy being in the company of a friend. For Nami, her best friend. Sure, there were others on board that she could talk more with, and with Vivi being the only other girl, there were things only they would talk about. But there were none that Nami felt closer, nor more comfortable with than Luffy. She leaned ever so slightly into Luffy's shoulder. He didn't seem to mind. Nami cast her mind back about a week, to when she and Luffy were joined by Vivi on deck. The princess had called her out on her crush on the captain. Nami had denied it vehemently, claiming it was childish, and would disappear before long. After all, a man like Luffy doing everything he had for her, of course she'd develop a crush on him. But even then, he was Luffy. Oblivious, blundering bumble that he was still her captain. There couldn't be anything between them. It would throw off the crew's dynamic. It just couldn't happen. Yet now, Nami couldn't help but think maybe she should just enjoy it while it lasts. She genuinely did believe it was just puppy love and would fade with time, but instead of denying it, and forcing those emotions back, maybe just enjoy it. Even if Luffy never realized, or feels anything back. Just bask in its warmth while she could. Who knew how long it would before she'd ever feel anything like this again? It would be her little secret. Hey Luffy, Nami said. What's up? He replied, looking over to her. Thank you for taking care of me, Nami said, smiling brightly at him. Luffy blinked, confused. But that wasn't me, he said simply. It was Chopper and the old hag. I know that, Nami replied with a laugh. I mean, for getting me to them, and just in general. Oh, that? Luffy exclaimed. It was nothing, you needed to see a doctor. But didn't you already thank me? I did, she said. I made sure to thank everyone else, as well. Sanji nearly died when I hugged him though. Nami sighed at that. At least he appreciated it. I just wanted to thank you again, seeing as that was the second time you've risked your life for me. Shishishi, I'm just happy you're still alive, he said cheerily. I'd do it again any time, and I'm glad you would. Lord knows where I'd be otherwise, Nami replied. She couldn't help Luffy's expression sour for a moment. Most likely contemplating such a scenario. It made Nami shiver to think about as well, the thought of her captain not being there when Arlong sold her out. She had not been in a good place. But I've been thinking, dangerous. Luffy cut in quickly. Nami felt her jaw go slack. Did Luffy just sass her? He was grinning widely at her, looking incredibly proud of himself. She would not stand for this. Like you're one to talk, Captain, she retorted. People in glass houses after all. You do it to me all the time. He shot back. Besides, what do glass houses have to do with it anyway? So he was just trying to get back at her. That was fair. Still, he had a long way to go before he would be able to outdo her in a battle of wits. It means dumbass, like you, shouldn't call other people stupid, Nami explained carelessly. Hey, that's no fair, Luffy exclaimed indignantly, and you haven't explained what glass houses have to do with it. Oh Luffy, Nami thought, looking at his earnest expression as he completely misunderstood the phrase, never change. It's an idiom, Luffy, she explained. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. There was a pause while Luffy processed this new information. "You're an idiot," Luffy said finally, face curiously straight. He thought she was calling him an idiot again. For some reason the word whoosh came to the forefront of Nami's mind. Nami sighed and shook her head, shaking free some snow that had come to rest there. Mr. Gen had warned her of this. "You should never argue with an idiot," he had said. "They'll only drag you down to their level and beat you with experience." She was 8 when he told her that, and she didn't fully understand what it meant. Now, she had first-hand experience. Truly, his wisdom was beyond anything Nami knew. "You're just proving my point, stupid," she said, giving her captain a dig in the arm, "and you've pulled me off track. I was gonna tell you something important." Luffy perked up. "You're gonna let me buy more food?" he asked hopefully, his eyes sparkling at the unfounded possibility of food. "Like hell," Nami snapped, smacking him over the head. "You'd run us dry in minutes, and you're not even the one that buys food anyway." Luffy scowled pathetically at her, like a child scolded. "I was wanting to say that I want to pay you back." "Why?" Luffy asked, dropping the sour look and raising an eyebrow. "You don't need to." "I did it 'cause I wanted to." "I am well aware," Nami replied, "but I don't mean by giving you anything, so no funny ideas, okay?" Luffy nodded, still looking curious. I want to get stronger." "Okay," Luffy said, not looking any clearer on the matter. "How's that paying me back?" "Because I want to show that you were right to do everything you've done for me," Nami explained. "I still don't get it," he said. "I did all that 'cause you're my friend. You don't have to do anything. This might take a bit of time." "Yes, I know that," she said, trying not to sound exasperated, "but I want to get stronger to prove your effort wasn't fruitless. Outside of Usopp, I'm the weakest of the crew in a fight, but even then, he is a marksman. If he's in a straight-up fight, something's gone horribly wrong to begin with." Nami continued, building up momentum as she spoke. "If we're gonna be fighting people stronger than Mr. 3 and Miss Golden Week, I need to catch up to the rest of you guys in some way. I don't want to end up being the one having to sit out of fights because I'm too weak. Especially since we're such a small crew. A weak link, like me, in a fight will only be exploited, and I don't want to be that. That's how I want to repay you. By getting strong enough that you never have to worry about helping me ever again." Nami finished feeling a little short of breath. This was something she was dead set now. The fight that awaited them in Alabasta was beyond anything they'd come across before, and that was to say nothing of what would come after. Nami refused to be a weakness. Throughout her little tirade, Luffy's confused expression slowly fell away as he clicked on to what Nami was telling him, slowly breaking out into a face-splitting grin. "That's awesome, Nami!" he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in the air. "You're gonna be super cool when you get stronger." He looked straight up giddy now. "So what you gonna do? New weapon training, something else?" Who knew Luffy found the idea of someone getting stronger interesting? Maybe because it was a member of his crew. "Ah, well, I'm glad you think so," Nami said, looking away from him, feeling slightly embarrassed. She had imagined he'd think it cool and would both acknowledge and back her up on it, but not for him to be so enthusiastic about it. "I asked Usopp to make a weapon I can use. He said that he had just the thing and that it would be really powerful. That, and I'm gonna retake up bow training again." Luffy's eyes sparkled at the prospect of an Usopp-made weapon. He most likely thought it was gonna be some absurd, god-slaying, super weapon, or some such nonsense, but given the way Usopp spoke to her when he accepted the job, it gave Nami some hope that it would be something special. "Woohoo!" Luffy positively squealed. "That's so cool! Usopp's gonna make something super awesome." He looked completely lost in his own imagination. "Oh, calm down," Nami said, giving Luffy's ear a twist. It was freezing to the touch. "Don't get ahead of yourself. We don't even know what it is yet. It could just be a metal staff." Luffy shook his head confidently, his ears stretching in Nami's grip. "Nah," he said, "Usopp's not so boring. He's gonna make you the best weapon. You have to show me when it's finished." That was probably a little hyperbolic, but it was nice to see Luffy so optimistic. Though optimism was Luffy's default state. "Sure, I don't see why not," Nami said, smiling at him. "Might it take a while though? I only asked Usopp before dinner." "That's fine by me," Luffy said. "Just one more thing to look forward to, I guess." Now that was a novelty. Luffy willing to be patient for something, rather than moaning and whining for it. Nami couldn't help but wonder how long he'd last. Judging by the way he was rocking side to side, grinning like a child on Christmas? Nami gave him 12 hours. "Oh yeah," Luffy said, as if just remembering something. If you're gonna be training, I'm more than happy to help you out. I appreciate the offer, Luffy Nami said, but I highly doubt you can teach me anything about fighting with a bow staff. It was nice of him to offer though, but if you want to spar, I'm down for that, so long as you go easy on me, that is. Luffy folded his arms, looking distinctly put out. I can too. I used to fight with a staff. Nami blinked. Wait, you did? Oh yeah. All the time with Ace. I left it back home, but there's gotta be a pipe around here I can use. Luffy explained. Nami just stared at her captain. For some reason she just couldn't imagine Luffy using a weapon. Okay, that wasn't true. She saw him try and use a sword against Arlong. What Nami couldn't imagine Luffy using a weapon effectively. So, you were actually good with it? Nami asked carefully, still trying to come to terms with this little revelation. Yup. Luffy proclaimed. I was. I didn't use it as much when I got better with my abilities, so I'm probably really out of practice. Actually, that seemed perfect for Nami. Now, she had no real faith in Luffy knowing any kinds of forms or techniques with the staff, seeing as he was just a glorified brawler. But if what he said was true, then he was, at least, experienced with one, which served her needs amazingly well. Nami nodded. She had decided. Alright, Luffy, she declared, I want to spar with you. Yay, under one condition. What's that? She gave him the nicest, most kindest, and absolutely not threatening his life smile she could. Go easy on me. Luffy just grinned. Sure thing. We'll start first thing tomorrow. And like that, the strongest sense of dread took over Nami. Like the storm cloud of a building hypercane charging over the horizon. It had suddenly occurred to her. Nami had never seen Luffy train. Zoro did it all the time, and she knew Sanji got in an hour or two every morning when everyone else was asleep. But Luffy? Nothing. Not a weight lifted, or a sit-up completed. Yet he was by far the strongest of the crew. What if Luffy's idea of going easy wasn't easy at all? After all, he never did anything by half. He either put 100% into something or just didn't bother to begin with. A pit opened in Nami's stomach. Images of Luffy running her through insane trials of strength and endurance, fit to kill men like Zoro and Sanji, filled her mind. She had made a huge mistake. Hey! You okay? Luffy's voice brought Nami out of her nightmare-fueled stupor. You're gone really pale all of a sudden. Are you sick again? He started to panic. No, I'm fine. Nami replied, her voice shaky. Just, let's start training after Usopp gets me my weapon. Ah, you sure? He sounded disappointed. We don't have any big animals for you to fight, but I can fill part. It'll be foo. No! Nami couldn't interrupt him fast enough. She did not want to know any more about it. Let's just wait a bit. I'm technically still recovering after all. That was a lie. She was perfectly fine, but he didn't know that. Oh, then that's fine. We'll wait, Luffy said with a small shrug. Bullet dodged. Nami swore she'd get strong, and she'd work her hardest to see it through. What she didn't want was to be killed by Luffy's idea of training. That could wait a while yet. Right, Nami said, pushing herself up. Best we get to bed, snow's gonna pick up soon. That, and the lamp was getting dim. Ah. Luffy whined, but I just got comfortable. Yeah, well, tough. It's Baltic out now, and we need sleep. Nami ripped the snow-covered blanket off his legs and shook the snow off all over him. He didn't look too happy about it. With all the white, fluffy debris taken care of, she began for folded up. There was a soft ruffling and crunching of snow behind her. Throw so much as a flake at me and I swear I'll throw you overboard and elect Zoro captain, Nami said, not even looking at her captain. The soft crunch and pathetic moan confirmed her suspicions. Blanket now under arm, she turned and grabbed Luffy by the wrist, pulling him to his feet. With her spare hand, Nami dusted the snow off his shoulders and hat. Probably with more care than she intended. Nami was determined to savor these nights, these moments, as best she could and for as long as possible. Who knew what was to come next? Alabasta was going to be a major event, both for them as a crew and the people of the country itself. Nami couldn't help but feel that this is where they'd make a name for themselves. Whether that was a good thing or not, she had yet to decide. She smiled at Luffy's back as she shoved him towards the men's quarters. Regardless, there was nowhere else she'd rather be. Alabasta had a truly magnificent sunset. The way the sun drifted lazily towards the western horizon, slowly setting it on fire as its light reflected off of the gold and red sands of the desert was one of the treasures of the world. Nami could have watched it for days. Correction, Nami had watched it for days. Every day since the end of the battle with Crocodile and Baroque Works, she has sat in the palace infirmary watching it take place. The hospital wing of the palace at Alyabarna was positioned just perfectly to see the sun fall, framed by a pair of sculpted, marble pillars at the furthest end of the room. Honestly, Nami would never get bored of it. Of course, the day's sunset had been hours ago. The temperature had dropped, and a beautifully waxing moon hung gracefully in the sky. Nami herself now sat bedside reading by candlelight, learning about Alabasta's geography and topology. It had been a week since Baroque Works fell, and Alabasta was saved. Yet Nami remembered the events clear as day. From meeting Ace and Nanohana, and escaping from a fleet of billions, to Yuba and meeting Old Man Toto, to Rain Base and confronting Crocodile, then finally to Alyabarna and facing down Baroque Works for the last time. It was the longest 3 days of Nami's life. So much happened in so little time, but the days that followed fell away like so much water through her fingers. Nami pushed her reading glasses up her nose and turned a page. It was freezing tonight, colder than the night after leaving Drum, it seemed. Luckily, she'd been provided with the fluffiest cotton dressing gown to keep her cozy on nights like these. She could get used to living in a palace. It had taken Nami a couple days to recover. Thankfully, most of her injuries were clean puncture wounds that were stitched up pretty easy. What kept her out of commission longest was plain exhaustion, and so after 3 days of bed rest, Nami was as good as new. Thankfully, almost everyone else was up about not long after as well. Almost everyone. Zoro was still injured, but, much to Chopper's irritation, he was back to training as soon as he could move, with no regard for tearing open his wounds. Honestly, that man's insistence on not letting himself heal was going to come back and bite him in the ass, and the rest of the crew by proxy. He was absolutely hopeless. The only other out-of-commission crew member was Luffy. According to Vivi's father, Cobra, after defeating Crocodile, and being given an antidote for the warlord's poison, her captain carried both the king and Miss All Sunday out of the Tomb of Kings to safety, then promptly collapsed, unconscious. That had been a week ago. He was still out. Nami sighed. She replaced the bookmark and closed the book, then placed it on the bedside table. She'd been staring at it blankly for the last 10 minutes, not really taking anything in. There was just a lot on her mind. Nami looked down at the comatose man laid out beside her. Luffy looked fine. His breathing was clear and even, and all his injuries were either cleanly bandaged or already healed. Apparently, the worst of it was a stab wound on his chest that he'd gotten from Crocodile outside Yuba, and it would leave a small, pale scar at worst. Everything else was a mix of internal damage, extreme dehydration, and exhaustion. Not much they could do but wait. Nami reached over and gently brushed away a strand of hair from her captain's forehead. He didn't react. She couldn't help but wonder if she should be worried for Luffy at this point. 7 days was a long time to be unconscious. The doctors, Chopper included, put him on a drip to rehydrate him and keep him that way, but surely his muscles would start to atrophy, and going so long without food when suffering from extreme exhaustion could not a good combination. Especially for a glutton like Luffy. Despite this, Nami wasn't concerned at all. The crew had been reassured he'd be fine, and any issues that became apparent upon his waking up would be dealt with then, so there were no problems on that front. She didn't even feel that irrational fear that one would expect when seeing their best friend laid out for days on end. Nami didn't feel any of that. Instead, she felt pride. Pride in her captain. Pride in her fellow crewmates. Pride in herself. They had done it. They faced down a royal warlord and his crew, and won. They all did. It felt like a milestone that one day they'd look back on and realize how significant it was. A small smile spread across Nami's face as she basked in the warmth of the feeling. Why wouldn't she? Usopp and Chopper took down a pair of high-ranking numbered agents with freaky devil fruit powers, and their dog. Zoro took down the highest-ranked agent outside of Crocodile himself, gaining the ability to cut steel in the process. Nami herself had taken down Mr. One's partner on her own. Thankfully, giving Luffy his requested demonstration of her completed weapon meant she had to look through the manual Usopp gave her, meaning Nami was a bit more prepared for the Climax's more eccentric capabilities. Didn't stop her getting almost clobbered though. Then Luffy, moronic, clueless, bumble that he was, beat a warlord. Not a self-proclaimed warlord. An actual member of one of the ocean's three great powers. That warlord. It was crazy to think about. It could have been a fluke, really. Crocodile didn't seem to be taking them all that seriously for the longest time, just playing with them while working his plan towards fruition. But then again, they weren't the ones rotting in a jail cell. The first major hurdle had been toppled. Now, it would serve as precedent for anything to come after. Nami's smile threatened to break out into a full-on grin, but she held back. Instead, she just looked down at her captain with a growing feeling of affection. He was such a dumbass. Her dumbass. She reached out once more and stroked the back of her hand down his cheek. Wait, was that? Did Luffy have stubble? Nami snorted. I am so teasing you about this first chance I get. The night before they landed in Nanohana, Nami ribbed Luffy for being so baby-faced. He, of course, took exception to that, claiming that he could grow a beard, he just didn't want to. Nami then asked him how often he shaved. The delightful shade of pink Luffy turned as he told her twice a day, was an image that she would treasure till the day she died. Oh, you're up too. Nami spun in her set so fast she nearly fell out of it. A shadowed figure stood in the doorway to the infirmary. Slowly they began to walk towards Nami. It was Vivi. The princess was in a similar state of dress as Nami. Pajamas covered in a fluffy cotton nightgown. You couldn't sleep either? Vivi asked, taking a chair to sit on. Something like that, Nami said with a nonchalant shrug. It was more a case of she'd just gotten used to staying up late with Luffy. What's got you up? Oh, you know. Vivi chuckled nervously. The princess looked out the window above Luffy's bed. Stuff. Nami caught on immediately. You've made your decision, haven't you? Vivi flinched like she'd be struck. Her eyes were closed tight and her teeth gritted. She looked like she was expecting to actually be hit. You want to stay? It wasn't a question. I do, Vivi whispered. Silence hung over them like a shadow. Okay, Nami said. She wouldn't question her friend's decision. It wasn't her place. You're sure? Vivi sounded hesitant, almost taken aback. Why are you so nervous? Nami said with a laugh in an attempt to lighten the mood. It's not like we're gonna shout at you, or force you to come with us. The princess chuckled lightly. I know, she said. I wasn't expecting to have to tell you so soon. I wasn't exactly prepared. Don't worry about it, Vivi, Nami smiled at her friend. She was such a good soul. I promise, I won't tell anyone else. Thank you, Nami. As hopeful as Nami was that Vivi would join the crew, she wasn't surprised that she wouldn't be. After all, everything Vivi did these last 2 years was all for her country. To ask her to leave after just getting back would be nothing short of cruel. Still, it didn't mean Nami wouldn't miss her. Vivi had been a part of the crew for months now, so for her to leave, as understandable as it was, would be a big blow. One thing was for sure. Vivi would always be a straw hat. Nami felt Vivi grab her hand. She looked up to meet her friend's gaze. Tears were beginning to shine in the princess's eyes. I am gonna miss you guys, Vivi said, her lower lip pushed up as she fought against to cry outright. The familiar stinging sensation began to build in Nami's sinuses. She pulled her hand out from under Vivi's and dragged the poor girl into a tight embrace. We'll miss you too, Nami whispered in her ear. It took a second for Vivi to react. Slowly she wrapped her arms around Nami's waist, gripping at her nightgown, and buried her face into the navigator's shoulder. Nami, with her arms around Vivi's neck, put one hand on her head and the other across her shoulders. They stood in silence. The princess gently wept, letting the sadness at the thought of having to leave her friends fall freely. Nami gently rocked side to side, trying to offer as much comfort as she could. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she would not cry. They would see Vivi again, and she would always be one of them. They stayed like that for several minutes, allowing Vivi the chance to calm down. Finally, when they pulled away from each other slightly, they could only laugh at the red rimmed eye the other sported. I think I needed that, Vivi said, sounding relieved. Haha, I know what you mean, Nami replied. Best to get out of your system. Oh, most def, Vivi yawned loudly. Definitely. Looks like it's past the little princess's bedtime. Nami teased. You might be right, Vivi admitted, cheeks a rosy pink. It's kind of embarrassing. I only just got here. You got what was keeping up out of your system, Nami said with a shrug. Come on, let's get you to bed. She leaned over to the bedside table and blew out the candle. She'd get her book in the morning. Nami took off her glasses and stored them in her nightgown pocket, then offered an arm to Vivi, who took it gladly. They left the infirmary feeling light and sleepy. Nami cast one last look over her shoulder towards her sleeping captain. Hopefully he'd wake up soon. All these late nights by herself were getting lonely. 000.